as political persecution. In May 2022, David was granted refugee status in Ghana after a lengthy process. The Ghanaian government recognized the legitimacy of his claims and issued him a refugee travel document. This new chapter in his life allowed him to continue his work without the looming threat of arrest or violence hanging over him. All that would change the following year when the military junta overthrew the Nigerian government in July 2023. David's life took yet another turn after he leaked a sensitive document that allegedly detailed orders from Tinubu for Nigerian commandos to intervene in Niger. He was designated an enemy of the state by the Nigerian military and intelligence agencies. The Nigerian government quickly responded and tried to lean on the Ghanaian government to have him brought back to Nigeria for prosecution despite his refugee status. David responded with a video in which he passionately appealed to the Ghanaian government not to give in to the demands of the Nigerian government. He also exposed a failed attempt to have him illegally rendered by the Nigerian intelligence agency.
I was informed that a Nigerian intelligence agency, I'm not sure whether it was the National Intelligence Agency or the Defense Intelligence Agency, but one of these foreign intelligence institutions dispatched a jet to Accra to basically have me illegally rendered to Nigeria. Apparently they wrote a letter to the Ghanaian government accusing me of apparently aiding terrorism.
In November 2022, he published a documentary on Bola Ahmed Tinubu's drug case. His life, which had been upturned since 2020, took another course. His investigations raised uncomfortable questions about Tinubu's academic credentials and alleged past involvement in narcotics. As his articles gained traction, David became a person of interest in Nigeria, facing increasing scrutiny and threats from the government.
An accountant living in the Chicago area who worked for Mobil Oil Nigeria with a declared monthly income of $2,400 had just deposited over $1.4 million in the bank. Drug dealers need accountants too. The main character of this story is an individual whose entire existence is as puzzlingly mysterious as it is loud and public.
Following the fire at Dangote refinery, David once again found himself amid controversy after he revealed an offer from a climate change group to have him write a damning story to discredit the existence of the refinery. David's rejection of the offer surprised people who believed his criticisms of Dangote in the past would make him jump at the chance to throw him under the bus. As usual, he took to his Twitter handle to explain his position. First of all, my criticism of Dangote refinery has always been about the timing of its delivery and the politics that made them commission it in May 2023, nearly 2 years before it was due to be fully operational. That was, and remains, an entirely valid criticism. Every other criticism I offered revolved around concerns of monopoly business practices and potentially turning Nigeria's energy market into a monopoly, which is also a very valid concern. Ideally, one entity should not control the energy market for 200 million people. However, where the choice presented is between a potential domestic energy monopoly and the imposition of eternal energy poverty and import dependence by foreign actors, which side do you think I'm going to pick? You think I'm going to campaign for the continued poverty of my continent for the benefit of some rich white guy simply because I don't like Dangote?
Oh, this was a story where I was essentially just supposed to color in the blanks, fill in the gaps, and put my name on it. And it also became very clear that this story was intended to use the language of environmental activism and concern about climate change and Nigeria's energy transition commitments and all those related things.
David's passion for a working country spreads across Africa. He shares his thoughts on the socio-economic and political issues affecting Africans in Africa through his Twitter page. Following the suspension of Kenyan-based African Streams Media on YouTube and across all Meta apps, David warns of the danger of divergent news censorship by people he describes as the Lobito Corridor people. He says, "Unfortunately, the Lobito Corridor people are not capable of changing their worldview or adopting new tactics because here we are in big 2024, And Blinken is here accusing me and the guys in Nairobi of being Russian government cutouts. This tells me two very important things. One, the work that African Stream and others in the non-Western controlled African media space are doing is having a real effect in cutting through decades of foreign propaganda and raising the independent consciousness of the new generation of internet-savvy young Africans. The US state propaganda machine cannot keep up with social media, so it is lashing out with petulant stunts like holding a press conference falsely accusing an independent media platform in Nairobi of being run by RT with zero attempt at providing any evidence for such a claim. 2. Washington, D.C.'s Lobito Corridor government is planning to go to war in Africa. The first act in war is controlling the narrative. This is an attempt to destroy sources of alternative viewpoints so that Africans can once again go back to having only America, woo-woo, as our news. When the information war is won, then the shooting war will commence. Dear African, you are under direct attack. Raised in an upper-class Jehovah's Witness home, David described how going on evangelism to parts of Lagos that were opposite, different from the plush neighborhood he was raised in, forced him to see the reality of the majority of Nigerians. He would later break away from the faith, which he calls a cult, when he got married in 2015 to a woman whom his family did not approve of. The marriage ended a few years later. In a post on his Twitter handle in July 2023, David tacitly said he had found love again. David has 2 published books to his name. The first, The Jungle, a personal journey with the enfant terrible of Nigerian journalism, whose launch came laden with controversies and was finally released in 2023 to critical acclaim. The book was ranked among Nigeria's best-selling non-fiction titles in 2023. In his sophomore book, Breaking Point, A Journalist's Quest for Salvation, in Nigeria's Chaos, released in January 2024, David writes about the challenges he has faced, reflecting on his private struggles. He talks about the emotional toll of his investigative work and the pursuit of truth, all while seeking moments of joy and fulfillment amidst chaos. His work has not gone unnoticed. David has received several prestigious awards, including the People Journalism Prize for Africa in 2020 and the GRC and Anti-Financial Crime Reporter of the Year in 2021. He was also the 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. However, no prize has equaled that which he has had to pay for the work he does, where he lives a life of constantly looking over his shoulder and no place to call home, as he reflects in a post on his Twitter handle. Personally, have done my part, and I have paid a terrible price for it. Just how terrible you really have no idea. The last time I had a fixed address, I was 28. I'm 33 years old now. I have never tried to be a hero. Everything I ever did was because I genuinely believed in walking my talk and acting my beliefs. That's why I've never asked for help or complained about my circumstances. Today, David Hundeyin stands as both a troublemaker and a savior, a title that reflects the polarized views surrounding him. To some, he is an enemy of the state. To others, he is a champion of truth and justice, a champion who, unlike the people he fights for, has had no place to call home. 4 years ago, on October 20th, 2020, my ongoing journey began with the Lekki massacre, which happened just a couple of kilometers from my apartment. Within the next 17 days, I was forced to smuggle myself out of Nigeria, and I haven't been able to go back since.
All right, David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Hope you can hear me.
Yes. You know, when enemy of the state is supposed to appear on a show and we didn't see him, we were worried whether the state got hold of you. What happened?
There was an unexpected complication over here, and I lost access to my Wi-Fi for a couple of hours. And I've literally just been scrambling all over the place, but here I am. So
All right.
hopefully no further disruption.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for making time for us and for joining us. Where do we start? There's an election happened here, and Trump was re-elected, and you've been
Yeah.
making comments about that. You think it's a good thing for Africa? Can you?
I think it potentially could be a good thing for Africa. In and of itself, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but I think it represents an opportunity. And the opportunity here is specifically in the case of Nigeria, Kenya, and a few other African countries that are very highly captured by American interests in terms of the control that the State Department and the CIA have over their presidency or their government apparatus. For those countries in particular, the next 2 to 4 years represents an opportunity to reclaim some of their sovereignty if they're interested in doing such a thing. And the reason is that the amount of coordination that it takes for the State Department and its partners across the security and intelligence and diplomatic services in the US to effectively dominate a foreign country, that coordination, we're probably not going to see it over the next 4 years because Donald Trump is the proverbial bull in a China shop. Um, these two actors, that's Donald Trump on the one hand and the so-called deep state on the other hand, have never liked each other. But now that's the animosity has been amped up by a factor of 10 or 20 because he has a grudge. He believes that in addition to having sabotaged his presidency the last time around and having supposedly stolen an election in 2020, which he still believes was what happened, he also believes that they have tried to kill him twice because, as you know, there were two attempts on his life during the campaign period. We don't know who was responsible, but he believes that it's the men in suits that did it. We will never know, obviously. And they've also dragged him through criminal courts. His face has appeared on a police mugshot. So they've given him every incentive in the world to want to go after them. And in addition to all of that, this is obviously his second term, so he has no re-election to look forward to. So from day one, Trump has no incentive to pump the brakes. So every grudge he has against the people from that, the so-called deep state, that's the diplomatic services, the intelligence services, the security establishments, the civil service, the State Department, the Justice Department, that entire intelligence community is going to be in his crosshairs. He has already said so. So what that means for countries like Nigeria and others like it across Africa that have been captured over the past few years is that um, the sort of foreign domination that we have been experiencing, we have an opportunity to cast it off because the entity, the US government, which has been imposing that domination for the next 4 years, is going to be far too occupied with its own internal fires. It's going to be way too busy fighting itself. Trump is going to be fighting everyone within Washington, D.C., whom he perceives as part of the so called swamp. And it just so happens that the swamp is the same, group of people and institutions that are responsible for coordinating what is normally referred to as the empire. So basically, countries around the world where the U.S. government has a significant amount of influence, both stated and unstated, as in the case of Nigeria. So what this means for us practically over the next 24 to 48 months is that, for example, if there were to be a situation where maybe there's an election or there's some sort of nationwide revolutionary campaign, whatever it is, the person who is occupying the incumbent can no longer count on the U.S. establishment for support and backing to remain in their position. And we have a sort of very recent example of how it works when the US stands behind someone who is unpopular in their country. So in Kenya, as you know, as recently as 3 or 4 months ago, at a point it looked as if William Ruto was certain to have to step down. At a point, he had to fire his entire cabinet. His government looked to all intents and purposes like it was dead. There was no way, there was no realistic way forward for a William Ruto presidency. It looked like that. His country was quite literally burning in a way that it hadn't done maybe since the days of Daniel Arap Moi. And the US ambassador made the call that Ruto is our guy. Ruto has carried out every instruction we have given to him. As you may be aware, the U.S. mission in Haiti, which uses Kenyan manpower as its front. So basically, it's a U.S. funding essentially a neo-colonial occupation of Haiti using Kenyan police and Kenyan troops, and Kenya is getting paid for that, right? So essentially, Kenyan fathers and uncles and brothers, Kenyan men are being sent to die in Haiti for American interests, and the Kenyan government is getting paid for that. That's the sort of relationship that exists between William Ruto and the U.S. government, and because of his very sort of loyal and unquestioning acquiescence to everything that has been asked of him by the U.S. government, they stood behind him and made it such that every diplomatic support that was needed for him to survive. Bear in mind that the entire Kenyan government has basically changed since July. The entire cabinet has changed. Even the vice president is no longer there. The only person who has survived is William Ruto because he's a very loyal US puppet, right? That's what the US can do for you if you're a good enough puppet to them. They can keep you in charge of a country when your people don't want you there, right? They have the power to do that. So now that over the next 24 to 48 months, depending on how long it takes Trump to enact this campaign of revenge that he has in store for the deep state. A lot of these characters, first of all, they're not going to be in the State Department anymore. A lot of them are going to resign or get fired. Some of them have already started resigning. And the ones who are left over are going to be way too busy trying to appease whoever it is that needs to be appeased in Washington, D.C., trying to survive and keep their jobs, or just trying to put out fires back home to be able to effectively coordinate whatever it is that they're doing on the continent. So that means that within that time window, if the Kenyans then decide to do a Ruto must go part two, he isn't going to survive this time. And something similar could happen in Nigeria as well, maybe in the context of an election. I don't know. But the point is, everyone who has an interest in concepts like sovereignty and freedom, the next 48 months are very crucial in casting off whatever needs to be cast off. Because after that, I fully expect that, even if it's another Republican, I think the only president in the US that offers this kind of opportunity is Donald Trump. I don't think anyone else offers this opportunity. So I think once Donald Trump leaves office, the US establishment is going to regroup and is going to return. So whoever hasn't successfully purged their country of any malign influences by then, well, good luck to them.
You were part of EndSARS. Did you see the hands of the Americans in stopping it for the government?
Absolutely, absolutely. In in the case of EndSARS, it wasn't a direct intervention like it was in Kenya. So in Kenya, they supplied equipment to the Kenyan police. So those water cannons and tanks they were using on protesters. So if you look closely, even the uniforms the Kenyan police were wearing, you would see American flags on them. So there's very direct intervention in the case of Kenya. In Nigeria, it was a bit more indirect. So what happened was, after the Lekki massacre, for example, it was widely expected that based on, you know, expectations that one would have of the US government. These are the people who fund all these NGOs and CSOs concerned with human rights and civil liberties, expansion of the civic space, all your MacArthur foundations and your OCWAs, these are all US establishment funded institutions that are constantly pushing these messages. So we expected that the US government and its affiliate organizations in that space would, at the very least, issue some sort of very strongly worded condemnation what happened. And instead, what happened was radio silence across board. So I remember when I just left, so the massacre happened on the 20th of October. I left Nigeria on the 6th of November, 2020. And between that November 6th and I think about March the next year, I reached out to everyone I knew because, as you know, I used to be quite chummy with the U.S. embassy with the U.S. consulates in Lagos, right? I used to attend all their. I was always getting invited to one event or the other. In fact, in 2018, they nominated me for the IVLP. I don't know if you're aware of that. So I was a friend of the house. So I reached out to everyone I knew, and not just in the US, also, US allies, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, everyone I knew in the diplomatic space in Abuja and in Lagos. That why is no one saying anything? This guy has just murdered hundreds of innocent protesters on the streets, civilian protesters, unarmed civilian protesters. This is worse than a war crime, right? How can there be no response whatsoever? And I used a lot of energy reaching out to people, and and eventually the one time I got any kind of response, it wasn't even from an American. The Americans completely blanked me. The one time I got a response, it was from someone who works with the who used to work with the EU delegation to Nigeria. And what he said, not in so many words, was the only concern that um sort of NATO and sort of NATO affiliated, governments have with Nigeria at that point in 2021, the only concern we have is stability. So, in other words, anything that could potentially bring down the government of Buhari and could potentially lead to some sort of upheaval in Nigeria, we're not interested in that. So, even if he implied this, he didn't say this, but he implied this. He implied that even if the only way to maintain that stability was to send weapons to Buhari to shoot more protesters, that they would do it. That was the implication of what he said. And that was when, for the first time, I had my sort of like my come to Jesus moment, that these people that you think are your allies and your friends are interested in your civil liberties and your freedoms and your human rights. They're really not. The only thing that they're really interested in is their own interests. If their interests happen to align with yours, then sure, they're very happy to help you out. But if your interests do not align, you're not a person, you don't matter. So, and it was, that was someone obviously from the EU delegation, but I could also extrapolate from that. This was the reason why the US government kept completely silent. Completely silent. There was no response whatsoever. Joe Biden came into office in January 2021, right? So you could say, okay, the massacre happened under Trump. So, maybe it was Trump's responsibility to, his government should have said something. Maybe Mike Pompeo, who was then the US Secretary of State, should have said something. He did say something, in fact, Mike Pompeo. He put out like a tweet or something. I mean, it wasn't like an official, he didn't officially put Nigeria's government on notice, but at least he said something, right? Joe Biden's government came in, and from day one, made no secret of the fact that they were best of friends with Buhari. They had no problem with him whatsoever. One of the very first decisions, foreign policy decisions that Joe Biden's government took, if you recall, when Anthony Blinken became the US Secretary of State, was that Nigeria had just been placed on a list of countries of particular concern for violation of religious freedom. This was a direct result of the work that some of us had put in when we put together the report titled Silent Slaughter, Genocide in Nigeria and Implications for the International Community. So it was the late Dr. Obadiah Balafia, Dr. Richard Ikebe, Dr. Ayadedoyi, myself, and a few other people who worked on this report. We submitted it to the US State Department and the US Vice President's office, the then Vice President Mike Pence. And we got the result of that was that Nigeria was placed on that list by Mike Pompeo shortly before he left office. That was Mike Pompeo's last major foreign policy decision as Secretary of State. And as soon as Anthony Blinken came in, literally a few months later, one of the first things Blinken did was take Nigeria off that list. So that was the clearest indication you could get that, in addition to not caring that this government has literally just murdered hundreds of innocent, unarmed civilian protesters, that they're actually happy with this government and they're actually facilitating and actively aiding and abetting what this government is doing. Because, you've had your immediate past Secretary of State put Nigeria on a list stating that this country is a country where there is a heightened risk for practitioners of a certain religion. They're undergoing a genocide in a part of the country in the Middle Belt, because Christians were undergoing a genocide in the Middle Belt. This was proven. And Anthony Blinken comes in and says, there's no problem. We're taking them off the list. Nigeria is fine. There was for the rest of Buhari's tenure, there was no kind of friction whatsoever with the US government. We're best of friends. And then after Buhari leaves, Tinubu comes in, and you can tell that the relationship is even closer. Then you have the FBI director visiting Abuja directly. You could tell that they're very chummy, right? So the sum and total of all of this was, I came to understand very clearly that up until that point, I had had an incomplete understanding of how the world works. Up until that point, I had been focused very much on what is happening in Nigeria. But when all this happened, I started to understand that Nigeria is part of the world. Nigeria exists in a global context, and there are global actors that have a lot more influence on what happens in Nigeria than even people in Nigeria. Right? Nigeria is not quite as sovereign as I once imagined it was. Right? And that these people who have this influence, they only use that influence in their own interest. They don't really care whether 200 million Nigerians die or not. That's not really their business. It's not that they hate Nigerians. It's just that Nigerians are not a factor. Nigerians are not important in their own calculation. So yeah, that was sort of how I started to come to an understanding of sort of moving away from just journalism that is focused on just exposing corruption and looking at the bigger picture that Nigeria exists within a geopolitical context, and Nigeria as it currently exists is not sovereign.
Now, talking about that bigger picture, you were credited with stopping a war, probably war between Nigeria and Niger, where you leaked official order from Tinubu that Nigeria should invade Niger to get out the coup plotters. What do you think? I know you do a lot of this extrapolation of what will happen. How would you think that would have changed West Africa if that had gone on the war?
Right. Okay, so first of all, I think I should specify that the person who actually leaked the document is a soldier. The person who actually had access to that military signal is a soldier, and he, from what I understand, paid an even heavier price because he was traced, apparently. So even though obviously I paid the price for being the one who actually put it out there and published it, so I paid a hefty price for that. But I think we shouldn't forget the person who it was who actually leaked it, and apparently was locked in a guard room for more than a year, to my understanding. I don't actually know if he has regained his freedom now. So we should keep that person in mind. That person is the real hero in all of this. That's the person who actually stopped this war from happening. I was just a vessel. Now, if that war or if that invasion had gone ahead, there are many things that would have happened. The most immediate consequence that I can think of is that it would have put Nigeria in direct conflict with a Russian-backed military. And what that means is that this Niger, as you know, it's not just supplied by the Russian military. It actually has a sort of de facto defense pact with the Russians. So if you attack Niger, it's not quite a defense pact that the Russians are then, mandated to attack you in return, but you know, in some way, shape, or form, we are going to get a response from the Russian military. Why that would have been especially disastrous for Nigeria is that, if you recall, earlier in the year, I exposed the fact that Nigeria, as it currently exists, um, has no functioning primary radar coverage in its airspace. There was a circular from the NCAA saying that an unidentified plane was seen flying over the presidential villa. It turned out to be a civilian aircraft, I believe the Max Air aircraft. But the point is, a country that cannot stop civilian planes from flying through unauthorized airspace, restricted airspace, that country was going to start a war with a country that was backed by the Russian Air Force, that has all the MiG 29s and MiG 52s, fourth and fifth generation fighter aircraft that Nigeria does not have, that has all the missiles that Nigeria does not have. It would have been nothing short of disastrous for Nigeria, even more so than Niger. Because the most Nigeria could have done to Niger, I mean, you know how they say that he that is down needs fear no fall. Niger was already pretty much one of I think, the bottom five poorest countries in the world. So whatever it is that you do to them, how much worse can it be than where they already are? Nigeria, on the other hand, has a lot more to lose. And I remember making this analysis on my Twitter handle last year that if I were in the Russian Air Force and I was looking at this, say Nigeria had actually staged that invasion, and it was my job to plot a sort of counter, a response to that, I can point at maybe 6 or 7 strategic locations for airstrikes that would have ended Nigeria as a going concern. Even as a civilian, I can think of those places, and this is how you end Nigeria as a going concern. I can think of the first and second Niger bridge. Those are like the key economic link points that link basically one half of the country to the other. You conduct an airstrike on both bridges, and the Nigerian economy essentially grinds to a halt. Add to that the Tactical Air Command base at Makodi, which is Nigeria's largest air force base. An airstrike on that, Nigeria's air force is effectively put out of commission. An airstrike on Third Mainland Bridge, and the economy of Lagos is effectively put out of commission. Add to that the Tinkan Island ports. Nigeria's ability to import and export is effectively put out of commission. And then maybe add the armory at Kachia, which is like it's the largest uh, uh, ammunition depot in Nigeria. So airstrike on that, the Nigerian military no longer has any capacity to mobilize large amounts of weaponry. And then maybe the two sort of bonus airstrikes on Mogadishu barracks in Abuja, Dudan barracks in Lagos. That's it. Nigeria has ceased to exist as a going concern. That's how weak Nigeria is. And Nigeria was somehow going to poke this bear for some unspecified reason. So the most immediate result of that would have been that Nigeria would have um, devolved into some sort of catastrophic refugee situation. And that would have had real implications for the rest of the West African sub-region, because where you have one country that is like 200 and something million, surrounded by countries that are like 30, 15, 10, 40 million here and there. And then that country, that big 800-pound gorilla breaks up, very suddenly, very violently, very unexpectedly. Those other countries are going to get overwhelmed, and the whole region basically devolves into chaos, total chaos. Nobody benefits. Nobody, right? It's very interesting. I also made this analysis last year that if you look at the map between Alaska and the northernmost point in Russia, the gap, which is known as the Bering Strait, is only 55 miles wide. So the distance between the US and Russia is about 55 miles. They have never fought each other directly. They have never fought each other on their own soil. They would rather fight each other in other people's countries. So they'll fight each other in Ukraine, in North Korea, in Afghanistan, in Cuba, everywhere else, in Angola, but they will never fight each other directly. So basically, you should never offer yourself up to be a theater of proxy war between those two elephants, right? Because those two players are only concerned about their own interests, right? So the Russians helping Niger is not because the Russians love the AES states. It's not because they love the concept of African sovereignty. It's not because they're trying to help the Nigerians. There's a specific foreign policy goal the Russians are pursuing. Same as the Western people back in Nigeria and ECOWAS who were trying to push someone into invading Niger. It's not because they have any love for African democracy or anything. Everybody's pushing their own agenda, their own interests. So you should never let yourself become the grass for two elephants to fight on. And that's what would have happened to West Africa. We would have become grass for two very well armed and very well motivated elephants to fight on. The proof of this is that even though that war didn't eventually happen, in some parts of Mali, if you recall, earlier this year, you had uh, uh, troops from Ukraine showing up saying that they are going to fight the so-called Wagner paramilitary forces who are present in Ukraine, effectively opening up another front in the Russia versus Ukraine war on African soil, right? That was the goal in all of this. It was to open up another front in the NATO versus Russia war on African soil. It really had nothing to do with the fact that Niger carried out a coup. Yes, that coup might have pissed off France, it might have kicked out French interests, it might have done this or that, it might have irritated France, yes. But that in itself wasn't important enough to start a war over. The real issue was that the powers that be wanted to start a war. And they had a look around the map. Where can we start a war on the surface of this earth to test our latest weapons, fight each other as we want to, Russia versus USA, and do so in a place where nobody's really going to pay any notice to it. Nobody's going to take pictures. It's not going to trend on Twitter. CNN is not going to report it. Nobody's going to care because it's just a bunch of black people dying in darkest Africa. Nobody cares. And that's what was going to happen to Niger and to Nigeria. So nobody would have won. And even though the war didn't happen, even just the fact of those sanctions being imposed by Nigeria and then the counter responses, there was a lot of economic carnage that still came out of it. Although thankfully it wasn't as bad as it could have been.
All right, thank you. Looking at the topography of West Africa now, something has changed with Trump coming in. We can say that Trump will not have the kind of antagonistic relationship with Russia, which means that Russia's interest in Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali wouldn't be something that the Trump's White House will be worried about. Now, what does that mean for Nigeria? Because I raised that issue in terms of if you look at the kids that were tried for treason, or they wanted to try for treason for holding the flag of Russia, that wouldn't be something that Nigeria will panic about, because the person in Washington won't be worried about Russian flag in Nigeria the way the Bidens probably are worried. And I want you to answer this question knowing that what we're hearing is that the Tinubu Aso Rock, we're not a big fan of Trump coming in, and now that they are in kind of panic mode, trying to be friendly with Trump.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not hard to see why. The APC administration, which started with Muhammadu Buhari, was basically installed by Barack Obama. To all intents and purposes, it was a U.S. regime change operation in Nigeria, a so-called color revolution, without being recognized as a color revolution. But that's pretty much what it was. That took place in 2015. So, it, you know, I guess the genius of it all is that not everybody who is involved in a regime change operation, a foreign directed regime change operation, understands that what they are taking part in is a foreign directed regime change operation. Many people who did what they did in 2015 were under the impression that they were doing so. It's a political revolution. They're kicking out a corrupt incumbent, and if this new one messes up, we vote him out too. And obviously, that's not what was happening at all. It was someone in Washington, D.C., that had determined that the current administration, whether it's corrupt, whether it's not corrupt, has nothing to do with the decision. The current administration in Nigeria is getting too friendly with the Chinese, and the rate of economic growth is getting to that escape velocity beyond which we will not be able to control them effectively any longer. So, two things need to happen. First of all, this friendliness, this relationship with the Chinese needs to be curtailed, and then this stratospheric economic growth needs to be curtailed as well, so that they can remain under control. And those were the two things that happened after 2015, because Buhari came in, and as soon as he came in, the most important economic decision in a generation that Nigeria was due to make in 2015, which most people have forgotten, which was the Naira Yuan swap deal, it's just immediately vanished off the table. Until today, we've not heard anything about it. For those who don't understand what the Naira Yuan swap deal would have done for the Nigerian economy, basically, the major problem why the Naira keeps depreciating and why consumer inflation keeps being such a problem in Nigeria is that most of Nigeria's imports are dollar denominated. So for you to actually import stuff into Nigeria, you have to pay US dollars for them. Meanwhile, the bulk of the things that Nigeria imports are actually things that are, in terms of consumer goods, are actually imported from China, right? So it really makes no sense. So what the Naira Yuan swap deal was going to do was make it such that Nigerians importing things from China could actually pay Naira to import those things, and Chinese importers buying things from Nigeria could pay yuan. So instead of needing to pay US dollars to import things, Nigeria and China would rather have a currency swap deal. That's the Naira Yuan swap deal. And what that would have done was that it would have significantly removed, first of all, it would have reduced Nigeria's import bill in terms of US dollars, and then it would have reduced Nigeria's dependence on the US dollar. And that would have eased a lot of the pressure on the Naira, which, on its own is responsible for so much of the economic devastation we've seen since 2015. That deal suddenly vanished off the table. And then, in addition to that, if you recall, Nigeria was a very key part of the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative, for those of your viewers who don't know, is a Chinese government program to essentially bring much of the world into China's economic and geopolitical ambit using infrastructure instead of force. So instead of pointing a gun at you and saying, come and do business with us, or come to our side, in our fight against the US or whoever, they would rather come to your country and build infrastructure. Obviously, they have their reasons for doing that. It's not free. It's loan funded, and they are the ones giving you the loan. But the point is they're building infrastructure that you couldn't have built by yourself and that you wouldn't have had for another century or so. And in return, they bring you into the ambit. So Nigeria was meant to be a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. In fact, most of the new infrastructure which is still being commissioned to date is Belt and Road infrastructure projects that were started off during the Yaradua and Goodluck administration. So your Lagos to Ibadan railway line is a Belt and Road Initiative project. Your Abuja to Kaduna railway line is a Belt and Road Initiative project. Your new Warri Deep Sea Port is a Belt and Road Initiative project. Your Itakwe to Abuja railway line, which is under construction, is a Belt and Road Initiative project. Your Abuja Metropolitan Railway system is a Belt and Road Initiative project. Your what's it called? What's the other one? Kano to Maradi. Yeah, Kano to Maradi railway line was supposed to be a BRI project as well, but somehow that also disappeared off the table. Now, apparently, supposedly, the African Development Bank wants to finance it. Let's see how far they go with that. The point is, Nigeria was meant, based on the trajectory that was built under the Goodluck Jonathan administration, Nigeria was meant to become geopolitically paired with China, which the US government did not like. Because if Nigeria does that, the rest of Africa will follow, and the US effectively loses Africa, which it sees as its resource base. The US sees Africa as the source for cheap industrial inputs, the source for cheap raw materials and natural resources to feed the global economy. So if that place that is the source for cheap raw materials becomes twinned with China and then starts building up an industrial economy of its own, then it's no longer going to supply cheap resources. It's going to use those resources for itself, or those resources are going to become a lot more expensive, which will upend the entire global economic system as we know it, which currently has the US on the top. That was the issue in 2015. So even though the people who were part of the APC or who helped the APC come into power might not have understood any of this, they just thought that they are unseating an incumbent and it's their turn to be in power. That's what was actually behind it. So the administration of Barack Obama, under the then Secretary of State, I think it was John Kerry, who was Secretary of State then, orchestrated this thing known as APC, which rose to power. And obviously, the APC retained power in 2023, and it just so happens that the person that became president in 2023 is someone that is not just this time around. So under Buhari, you could say that the APC was a US political project, but Buhari himself, you couldn't really categorize Buhari as a US puppet. Not really. You couldn't really categorize Buhari as that. You could accuse Buhari of a lot of things, but Buhari wasn't really a US puppet. He didn't have that sort of captured mentality. He wasn't someone that you would say the US has like dirt on him. He's being blackmailed or anything like that. You could accuse him of being mentally limited, which he was, but in terms of being a puppet, not really. Bola Tinubu, on the other hand, is the SI unit of a foreign intelligence puppet. This is someone who, in addition to his very well publicized criminal record history, his very well publicized criminal history and his record of political corruption, scandals, things that make him an ideal puppet because there's a plethora of blackmail material to be used against him. In addition to all of that, this is someone who, for the past 20 odd years, it was very well known that this person had been working as a US informant. So if you read through the WikiLeaks cables, this was mentioned in several places. That Bola Tinubu, both when he was governor and after his governorship tenure in Lagos, was constantly talking to one US embassy official or the other, constantly briefing them about this or that. So they don't have to tell you upfront that this person is basically Nigerian political informant, is a snitch. but it's pretty much laid out in front of you in those WikiLeaks files. Tinubu has been working for the US government for decades, right? So now, in addition to having a party, which is basically a US government project, a US government creation, they then have a head of state, a president of Nigeria, who is very much a US government, a US intelligence puppet, right? So it's no surprise that now that the so-called swamp, the deep state that put this whole project together, is now sort of threatened by the re-entry of Donald Trump into office and the fact that Donald Trump specifically hates these exact people for a completely different set of reasons, but he specifically hates these people. And all of them know that their jobs are on the line. All of them know that they're going to be in danger of not just losing their careers, but some of them might even, potentially be going to jail. If Trump is vindictive enough. Knowing all of that, obviously there's a lot of panic behind the scenes, and Tinubu knows that for the foreseeable future, he has actually lost the political cover that he enjoyed with the Democrats. He knows that. So for the next, who knows, maybe 2 years, some have suggested that it might not be up to 4 years. Some have suggested that 4 years is an optimistic thing. It might not even be 2 years. That basically, when the next US midterm elections come up, the Republicans under Donald Trump might no longer retain control of both houses. So their ability to go after their enemies might be degraded at that point. So some have suggested that it's only 20, the window is actually just 24 months. But the point is, whether the window is 2 days or 24 months, there is a window, which is, maybe it's already started, maybe it's going to start in January after the inauguration, but there's a window within which Tinubu is going to be politically exposed. He and his mates, his colleagues like William Ruto and elsewhere, will no longer be able to call up the US ambassador and use the US ambassador as basically their political bodyguard. That's no longer going to be possible for a while, because Trump, to put it in Nigerian terms, does not have their time. So I can completely understand why Tinubu would be bothered, and why the people around him. I mean, I was seeing I think it was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bolaji Akinyemi, went on a Rice TV and had a whole tantrum, basically about Trump winning the election. The tantrum had nothing to do with Trump being bad for Nigeria or anything like that. He was talking about US internal issues as if he's an American. And I was looking at it like, okay, so what's really your issue here? What are you really upset about? You're not really upset about, women's rights in America and all that. That's not what you are really concerned, because that has nothing to do with you. So we know what your real game, what's really worrying you. Or people like Sam Omashe, who, as you know, is a Tinubu mouthpiece, coming out and saying, "Oh, the the US electorate has disappointed him. That they've chosen a racist, blah 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 blah." And I'm like, oh, so you suddenly care about American racism? Is that so?
Let me play this video, and then I'll get your reaction at the end.
We have built a foreign policy of hectoring and moralizing and lecturing countries that don't want anything to do with it. The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding poor people, and I think that we should pursue a foreign policy, a diplomacy of respect, and a foreign policy that is not rooted in moralizing. It's rooted in the national interest of this country. Because Ambassador Sullivan is at the lead of moralizing instead of pursuing America's national interest, I object.
All right. That is the incoming Vice President of the United States. What he said there is exactly what is in Project 2025, which is that they are going to adopt towards Africa the Chinese model of dealing with African continent, which is not getting involved in human rights, gay rights, and all these cultural issues. They identified it as things that the African countries don't even care, and they don't care about that. So my question for you is, knowing that this is the policy that is coming, and in that document, that same document, they also talked about what Trump did the last time with Morocco and Western Sahara, which was that when it was time for him to get more countries to sign up to the Abraham Accords, they went to Morocco and said, you have to, if you have a relationship with Israel, we're going to let you control the territory you want to control. That everybody knows that Trump is transactional. If there's something, a deal to be had, he will put it on the table and move on. So how do you think that will play out in Nigeria? Don't you think that someone like Tinubu, who is also in the business of deals and doing favors don't you think that he could also be play that kind of game and get to the right side of Trump?
Well, I mean, so first of all, you'd have to put it uh, into cognizance that this meme about Trump being transactional, that all of a sudden everybody seems to understand the meaning of the word transactional. So Trump did not invent being transactional. So the presidents who have been in office before Trump and even after him, such as Joe Biden, were also transactional. Trump did not invent being transactional. And then if someone is trying to cut a deal, that would depend on two things. First of all, there has to be something that is a need for the person. The person has to see some value that could accrue to him for the deal to be worth it. So in the Moroccan example that you mentioned, Moroccan support for the Abraham Accords was what was in it for the Trump presidency, and then in return, gave them Western Sahara, whatnot. In the case of Nigeria, what is it exactly that Nigeria has to offer the US that the US isn't already getting from Nigeria? Pretty much nothing. And then, more importantly, in the case of Trump, the second thing is the person has to even see this entity as an entity worth striking a deal with. Trump thinks that Africans are basically resource monkeys. Trump described Africa as, shit. He described Africans as people from shithole countries. As far as Trump is concerned, Africa is a place on a map where your eyes just skip over it. Like it's not relevant to Trump's worldview, right? I wouldn't even. It's not even that he hates Africans. It's just that he doesn't really recognize Africans as people. Really, Africans are just not relevant in Trump's worldview, right? And as racist as that might be, I see that as a good thing. I see that as a useful thing because historically, the U.S. presidents who have a more nuanced understanding of what Africa is and the actual potentials that Africa contains, those presidents tend to be the most destructive ones for Africa. So Barack Obama, for example, supposedly a child of Africa himself. It was under Barack Obama's presidency that Africa's most um, devastating sort of political and economic setbacks of the past maybe 30 years were recorded because under his presidency, the most powerful nation states that Africa had managed to put together, which was Libya. They bombed Libya 7,000 times in 9 months, 7,000 bombing sorties, and reduced Libya to the Stone Age. That was the president that saw some value in Africa, right? So it was also under Barack Obama that the color revolution of 2015, which Nigerians erroneously thought of as their change era, happened. And as a result, Africa's fastest growing economy, most important and largest economy at the time, had its growth trajectory completely derailed. And now, 10 years or 9 years later, Nigeria has lost half of its economy relative to 2015, right? That was under the Obama presidency. That was the president that understood the value of Africa and, treated Africans, saw Africans at eye level and whatnot. So I'm not really concerned about Trump being transactional or, Trump not respecting the desires of Africans or anything like that. He's only in it for himself. First of all, every president in the US has always only been in it for themselves. This idea that Trump is specially transactional compared to Bill Clinton or George Bush or Barack Obama or Joe Biden is complete nonsense. They're all transactional. As we say very crudely in Nigeria, oimbo na oimbo. Like the the faces come and go, but the system does not change,
Yeah.
right? So Trump is not materially worse than what has come before him. So this whole thing, this meme that is being circulated on the internet, oh, he's so transactional. You don't know that guy. You think you think he's going to be neutral, but he's all about this, that, that. They are always all about
Okay.
what is in it for them. So people, I think, need to sort of focus more on the big picture. The big picture here is that based on precedent, this is very important, based on precedent, based on historical data, right? Because historical data is the closest thing you have to the ability to tell the future. Based on historical data, what is a Trump presidency's foreign policy likely to look like? And we have 4 years of historical data to make that projection. He was president between 2016 and 2020. Yes, he cut deals like the deal with Morocco. But in the case of Nigeria specifically, what did he do as president? When Buhari went for the state visit to the US, what did Trump do with that state visit? Famously, he said the first thing he did, he accosted Buhari and said, why are you killing Christians? And that might not sound like, a statesman-like thing, or that might not sound like an especially big detail, but that little comment saved thousands of lives in Nigeria, because as a result of that, the Buhari administration was, spooked enough to at least pretend to care about the genocide that was happening in the middle, but for a short while, right? What else did Trump do with the Buhari presidency? Nothing much, because again, as I said, there's nothing that the US wants from Nigeria that it isn't already getting. Nigeria is already a US vassal state. So again, people need to look at the bigger picture, that Nigeria is one or two levels above maybe the likes of Niger and Somalia. It's just one or two steps removed from that. Nigeria is already in a very dire situation. So what Nigeria should be looking for now at all costs is whatever can move it forward by any means necessary. And I'll just quickly close with this, that whenever any country in the world, like any of the so-called serious countries in the world, when a new US president comes into office, what those countries are concerned about is how can we manipulate this situation to our benefit. So when Trump became president, then we saw the Russians come out. President Putin came out and said that his plans for de-dollarization, basically, that he's going to slow down. And then, so essentially, he's extending an olive branch to Trump, that if you don't mess with us too much, then our plans for basically tanking the US dollar, we're going to slow down on those things. So, give and take. That's how everybody is transactional with their foreign policy. Why isn't Nigeria or African countries, why aren't we allowed to be transactional with our foreign policy? Because what I'm saying, which some people seem to find very, very difficult to accept, is that you take what you can get. And it doesn't matter who it is that is giving you this thing. Right? If you see an opportunity, you take it. But some people are like, no, Trump is racist. Trump is this, Trump is that. As a black person, you're not supposed to like Trump. Somehow that is supposed to be more important than the fact that Trump's presidency potentially offers some sort of geopolitical opportunity to you. That's not how a serious person looks at the world.
Now, talking about what might happen with your investigation with Tinubu, of Tinubu's documents, do you think that it's going to be a lot easier now to be able to get the documents released by the FBI now that Biden is out of office and Trump is coming in?
Um, so a lot of you have asked this question. First of all, I should specify that the documents were actually released last year. It's just that they were, heavily redacted. So the case which we pushed in court actually never ended. The case is actually still in court because we filed a new motion seeking to have the redactions removed. And for most of this year, we've been going back and forth. We've been pushing this. And we've got to the point now where the case is now due for something called a summary judgment. So a summary judgment is like the final stage of the case, is where a judge then gives a ruling to either maintain the redaction or to remove those redactions. And that summary judgment, based on what the judge said, can be delivered depending on whether the counterparty chooses to file any opposing motions or whatever. That judgment is due to be delivered anytime between this month and February next year. So whoever is president, unfortunately, doesn't really have too much of an impact on that because a judge is already sitting on the case. So whoever becomes president doesn't change the fact of the judge sitting on the case. So the judge sitting on the case is a lifelong Democrat, Beryl Howell, who was appointed to the federal bench by Barack Obama, and who, in her conduct of this case, has made very little attempt to hide the fact that she's very much on the side of the US establishment. And she actually does not want these records to be released. She has made very little attempt to hide it. So, what I think is likely to happen is that in terms of the legal case itself specifically, she's probably going to issue a judgment saying that based on some she has already said something like that. Actually, I thought it was total nonsense, but that's what she said when she initially granted Tinubu's lawyer permission to intervene in the lawsuit. One of the reasons that she gave in that preliminary ruling was that she said Tinubu's privacy concerns are not being adequately protected by the current participants in the suit. And I thought to myself that this is not just any judge, by the way. Beryl Howell is a judge who herself worked on expanding the Freedom of Information Act. So if there's somebody who knows about the Freedom of Information Act, like she knows it top to bottom, left and right, it's Beryl Howell. In fact, she has received a journalism award for expanding media access to government information. So for someone like that to then say that a president of a sovereign country has something called privacy concerns or privacy exclusions regarding information that is that should be on public record about this, it doesn't get more public official than a president. And yet a judge is saying that a president has privacy concerns. So you can already tell that this one is compromised to the core. So I'm not expecting anything significant to come out of a court case that is overseen by Beryl Howell. I you know this might be seen as I don't know, prejudicial comment or whatnot, but it's fine because it's not my name that's on the lawsuit. It's Aaron Greenspan's name that's on the lawsuit. So he's not the one making these comments. It's me. So I'm at liberty to say it. I think she's a corrupt judge, and that's the truth. I think she's a corrupt judge. So I don't think anything significant is going to come there. But having said that, I also think that under a Trump presidency, um, after that ruling comes out, I don't think that will be the end of that, because I think even if she maintains the reductions as there are, Trump has already signaled very strongly that one of his key policy focuses is going to be um, so, using sunlight as disinfectant. So I think if people like myself are able to do a good enough job with networking and with publicizing this thing to the right extent, to the right degree, and I mean, I'm not gonna make promises. I'm not gonna say too much. You understand? It's not a good idea to say too much. But suffice to say that if the case is made well enough and is made to the right people, some of whom I actually already have access to, there's every reason to believe that first of all, Trump has no pre-existing relationship with Bola Tinubu, and as I said, there's nothing Trump wants from Bola Tinubu that he's not already getting. Trump has no incentive to want to protect this guy, because protecting this guy, as far as Trump is concerned, is the same thing as protecting the same people who came after him. Because it just so happens that the exact people that are Tinubu's biggest backers, not just the deep state, but people within the Democrat establishment, specifically like the Clinton family, who are Tinubu's best buddies. Those are people that are Trump's sworn enemies. The counterpoint to that you could also mention is that the Shagori family happens to be in-lawed to Trump. So there's always that. So I guess long and short is I'm leaning toward we're going to have a positive outcome, but there's always a but. So we have to see.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the media. You've been able to talk about the non-Western controlled media and the other media that we see. I wanted to know what you think is the formula for media to be sustained in Africa. It appears to me that most of the media we still have now simply are surviving on grants and awards from foundations that are mostly Western. Is there any alternative to sustain the media that we see in Africa?
Well, so like part of what I'm trying to do with West Africa Weekly, for example, is to prove that there is another model for operating and running and funding media in Africa. Because as you very rightly said, pretty much all of Africa's consequential media space is directly, funded by foreign actors. So, which makes it such that, for example, in 2015, um, it seemed as if there was a consensus across the entire media landscape in Nigeria that Goodluck Jonathan is a president from the bowels of Satan himself, and he must go. And Muhammad Buhari is an offering from from the thighs of Jehovah, and everything will be right with the world if Muhammad Buhari becomes president. The reason that sort of media astroturfing was possible, which led to that sort of mass public brainwashing that we saw in 2015, was because pretty much the entire media ecosystem was in the pockets of the NGO and CSO people in Abuja. So your premium times and all these guys were not objective. These guys were not neutral. Everyone was, getting their money from an American. So the premium times, which is funded by the media network is a well-known CIA front. So where I use Premium Times as an example specifically because it's Nigeria's largest online, or it used to be Nigeria's largest online media platform, and it was perceived as the medium of record in Nigeria's internet space. So where you have the medium of record that is being directly funded by a cutout of a foreign intelligence agency, which has its own geopolitical goals in Nigeria, what kind of news are you going to be seeing in it, and what kind of framing of the stories are you going to be seeing it? And that's what we've been seeing. So one of the things I'm trying to prove with West Africa Weekly is that there's another way of doing things. That first of all, there's another model, because one of the things that I've had to accept, after years of fighting that reality, is that journalism is not profitable, and it's never going to be. So it needs to be funded the same way that um, research is funded, or the same way that I don't know, lobbying is funded. It needs to be thought of as something that is either a public good or something that is a necessary part of a larger sort of geopolitical, geostrategic, political goal. Whatever it is, it needs to be seen in that way. However, the flip side to that is if you accept that media cannot be run on a for-profit basis, it simply doesn't work. The Nigerian economy, despite how big you think it is, the Nigerian economy is simply not big enough to be able to run media, using like advert revenue and stuff. It doesn't work. I've tried. So I've experimented with a bunch of models. I've experimented with the gifting model, which is that the platform, I don't put a paywall on it. It's open to read. But if you see value in it, then please buy a subscription and pay. I've experimented with that. I've had mixed results, some good, some not so good. Actually, most of it not so good. I took on some investment last year, and this was investment from a group of Nigerians based in the US. These are not rich people. These are regular middle class Nigerians, Nigerian immigrants in the US who are trying to do something good in their country back home. And they came together as a consortium. They put some investment into the thing and basically tried to, so they put together enough money to like pay staff salaries for a couple of years, buy some equipment, and do some experiments here and there. We've experimented with video content, going into long form documentary making, that sort of thing. Um, but the long and short is that we're still very much in the stage of experimenting. We haven't actually found a model, a reliable model that can what's the word, consistently and unfailingly fund the sort of media that is needed in Nigeria. So where I think the missing link is in Nigeria is that the Nigerian private sector, for whatever reason, doesn't understand that it has to be involved in politics. The Nigerian private sector doesn't see itself as part of a bigger picture. The Nigerian private sector thinks that its existential purpose is to have a better Q3 than Q2. Right? The Nigerian private sector doesn't understand that. So, for example, earlier this year, we saw the richest man in Nigeria and one of his contemporaries, doing a whole display in public, including on Twitter, when the Dangote refinery was obviously being targeted and obviously being set up to fail by the government. It's very obvious. And I remember I made a comment at the time that when there was an election going on, these people who should have understood that this signature investment of theirs, there's no way it's not going to be politically exposed one way or the other. You don't invest 20 something billion dollars in a country like Nigeria and expect that investment is not going to be endangered by the entry of the wrong person into government. All right, because Nigeria is a country where in America the private sector holds more power than the states. In Nigeria, the state holds more power than private sector. So if you are trying to grow in the private, if you're trying to grow your private empire, you need to have you need to be involved in the states, right? You need to have leverage with the states. Otherwise, one policy will wipe you out. And we've seen this happen to rich Nigerians so many times. Billionaires who get wiped out by one policy, right? But the Nigerian private sector really hasn't caught on yet that funding media, funding policy research institutes, funding, political lobbying, right? Actual lobbying, not the crude version of it that we do in Nigeria, right? That these are not, they see those things as a cost center. So I remember in 2021, a friend of mine whose name I'm not going to mention is a very well respected researcher in Nigeria. And he was having a conversation with a Nigerian billionaire about the possibility of putting together a think tank, like a proper think tank, right, to make policy recommendations. You know, the way it is in the US, where these think tanks literally write legislation, which is then, adopted by someone in Congress who sponsors it and whatnot. So you get a bill passed and you think, wow, Congress came up. It wasn't Congress that came up with it. It was a private think tank, right? And this guy was trying to put together something similar in Nigeria, and he was having a conversation with the billionaire who, yeah, he loved the idea. And then when the conversation ended, was that the billionaire then wanted to know, how would this think tank make profit for me? And the billionaire couldn't understand that it's not the value of everything that can be measured in naira and kobo, or that can be done in a very direct way. That these things will have returns, but the return is indirect and it's a compounding return. That is not an understanding that the Nigerian private sector has at all. The Nigerian private sector sees media either as a business venture, which it is not. It categorically is not. Media is not profitable in Nigeria. If you go into Nigeria trying to make profit in media, you will lose your money and cry, right? Or they see it as, if they are funding it and they're not expecting a profit out of it, then they expect it to be small scale and they expect it to be just basically just a PR mouthpiece and nothing more, right? They don't understand that there's a certain power. So if you are Jeff Bezos and you own the Washington Post, it's not everything the Washington Post does that Jeff Bezos approves of. The Washington Post is more than just a PR mouthpiece for Jeff Bezos. They do actual journalism there sometimes, right? But Jeff Bezos understands that that's the price, that's the cost of being able to use that thing to influence your wider agenda. Again, that bigger picture thinking. That's something that you will find in the Western world a lot. That's something you don't find in Africa, specifically in Nigeria. So I think where things will start to change is where your Dangotes and your Tedolas and your Elumelus and your Ovias and whoever they are, the Dantatas and your industrialists start to realize that business is not separate from politics. Business is a realm of the state. So if you are trying to maintain or grow your business, you need to be involved with the state. The state and the politics of the state is far too important to be left to career politicians. These guys don't understand that yet. They try to live a parallel existence to the state, which simply doesn't work. So when they finally come to that understanding, then all these your guardians and punch and all, because they are all struggling, whether they will admit that to you or not, they are all struggling, they are all owing salaries. It's a bloodbath. When these guys finally realize the importance of media, they will buy up all these platforms and they will start funding them.
All right, let's look at you are considered an enemy of the state. Let's look at people who are in trouble in Nigeria. One of them is a friend of yours, Isaac Bristol. I think you know him.
Yes.
IP Dom Nigeria. What has he gone through? And there's a lot of people that we don't know their names that were arrested years back, and some of them we cannot account for them. What is going on with media space in Nigeria, and do you think it's going to get worse from where we are now?
So this actually started in 2015. This incremental degradation of the civic space in Nigeria, because it's not just the media space, it's the civic space in general. It's been shrinking incrementally since 2015. And the Tinubu government has taken this, has elevated this to new levels. All of this, by the way, with full knowledge and cover by the US government, which brought these people into power in the first place, right? So, under their watchful eye, the governments of Buhari and Tinubu have successfully created a situation within the Nigerian media where um, you don't even have a situation where journalists are getting arrested or anything like that anymore, because it doesn't even get to that point anymore. Nobody publishes any critical um, content anymore. So if you're going to publish critical content or content that actually threatens the status quo, like myself or like the person that you referenced, used to do, then you should know that you have to do so from the point of view of an insurgent outsider. So you actually have to be physically located outside the country, or you have to understand that at any time you need to be ready to get up and jackpot, because they can be coming for you at any time. So even before I left Nigeria, I I didn't know when I would leave, but I knew that it was coming. It's just a matter of time. The more you keep going after them, the more your cup is being filled, right? So we're in a situation now where um even the act of doing anything that is critical, anything that involves truth telling in a way that is not palatable to the government, one doesn't even have to be actively anti-government. One just needs to be critical. That's all. That is now a crime in Nigeria. So in the case of this freedom issue, for example, police later put out a statement declaring me wanted and accusing me of treason, amongst other things. Right now, I can understand the treason accusation in the context of the military. What's the word? There's a specific word for it.
Oh,
The,
story that
the
the
military,
that
yeah,
was
the military documents which was leaked through me last year. I can understand that, but they were talking about it in not just in that context, but also in the context of putting out information that is embarrassing to the government. Right nowadays, merely causing embarrassment to the government in and of itself is now seen as something of a crime. Right? That's that was I think the last time that was the case was maybe under General Abacha, right? So under Obasanjo, obviously there were civil rights violations, things used to happen, but by and large, there was enough self-awareness in the system at the time to understand that if even if you're going to go after journalists, you have to at least make an attempt to build up some kind of case against them. Nowadays, that's no longer the case. Nowadays, if a journalist just says something that you consider to be personally offensive, you can just instruct someone to go and pick him up. And that's that. We saw that a few days ago in Sokoto when a woman came to social media and made some mention of a new terror group that is terrorizing locals. And next thing we knew was the woman has been arrested by the police and has been charged for embarrassing the governor, and she was locked up. Right. So that's a new state of affairs that we started seeing in 2015. I believe the first time we ever saw something like that in the Fourth Republic was when I believe it was 2015 or early 2016. I think it was somewhere in Ogun State where a young man was arrested and locked up for naming his dog Buhari. And it seemed like such a strange and out of the way occurrence at the time, but it just kept happening and happening and happening. And then 2023, I remember the story of the young man, I think he was in either Kano or Zamfara, who was arrested and detained by the DSS for weeks because he made mention of Buhari's wife gaining weight and becoming fat at the expense of the people. And he was jailed for that, and the Tinubu government has elevated this to another level. So now I remember shortly after, I think this was like 3 months after Tinubu took office, Bayo Odonuga went on Twitter and said something to the effect of, I'm quoting him verbatim here, said anyone who says Tinubu was a drug dealer, that person is a son of a bitch. This is a presidential spokesperson talking. So this level of like combativeness toward anything remotely critical, it's a new phenomenon. It's a relatively new phenomenon, and unfortunately, it's only going to get worse unless, of course, as I said at the outset, Nigerians do something. I don't know what that something is. Nigerians do something to oust this guy was placed in that position through malign foreign influence. So it's up to Nigerians.
We are going to invite people who are in the audience to join us if you want to ask a question or make a comment. But before we do that, let me, there's one of your tweets. I cannot pull it up, but you remember when I said the first line. It started this way: the year is 2049. China and the NATO Federation are in their 15th year of their. Now, how did you? I like your imagination. I like where you took that story. The ending was surprising, but I want you to imagine the world 30 years from now. How do you think it will look like, considering the geopolitical games that are being played now? And give us your own take. Let me know what you think. How would Africa look like?
So that's the reason that is a very difficult question to answer. Is that normally what I would say is that, as I said earlier, the easiest way to look into the future is to use historical data and extrapolate. Now, the problem with that is if we're using historical data to extrapolate, then maybe 2049 is not even a year that we even want to survive to be alive in. So I have to use hope instead of data in this case, because if we're using data, then we're saying that nothing really changes and that Nigeria and Africa continue on the trajectory they're currently on. Then by 2049, maybe the population of Africa should have halved or something, because the world is becoming a dangerous place like that. But I choose to be hopeful because I'm an African. I come from Africa. Africa is where I intend to live the majority of my life. It's where I intend to be buried. So it's where I intend to raise a family. So if I'm not hopeful, if I'm not bullish about the future of Africa, then why do I even exist? So I'm going to go with hope instead of data here. So bear with me. So I would say based on my hopeful expectation of what Africa should be in 2049, I think by that time Africa should have at least $2 trillion economies. So Nigeria was supposed to be Africa's first $1 trillion economy, and that was supposed to happen this year, if you recall, based on the trajectory that was established from 2015 on. It was projected by, I think, JP Morgan that Nigeria would be Africa's first $1 trillion economy by 2024. Nigeria is currently a $250 billion economy. It's basically halved in 10 years. So, that's a sad story. But I would expect that by that time, Nigeria and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Ethiopia, if not, so Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia should be at $1 trillion, at or around $1 trillion each. And the reason I include Egypt and Ethiopia is simply because of their population. So after Nigeria, those are the two most populated countries on the continent. Um, Having said that, I also think that there will, even despite the hope, I think there are some places that are beyond hope. So I think the DRC, for example, I don't think it will still exist as one single country by then. I think at that point it will have been balkanized, with or without the consent of the people that live there. Because I mean, currently, as you may be aware, the DRC is a country that only exists nominally. The government in Kinshasa is the government of Kinshasa. In like North and South Kivu, the Kinshasa government basically has no influence there whatsoever. They do not rule. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the Rwandan government, which is constantly, denying having direct involvement in Kivu, the Rwandan government probably has more influence over what happens in Kivu than the Kinshasa government. That's how bad the situation is. So I don't think by that time we'll still have a single country called the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think there should be at least three countries in that space
Do
by
you,
then.
do you think do you think Nigeria will still remain one, especially knowing that Simon Ekpa and his group are going to declare a Biafran Republic on the 2nd of December?
So if the risk of Nigeria breaking up is based on what Simon Ekpa might or might not do, then Nigeria is not going to break up. However, um, obviously, as we know, there are far bigger threats to the contiguous existence of Nigeria than Simon Ekpa. Simon Ekpa at best is a pawn. At best, is being used and doesn't even understand it. He doesn't strike me as a particularly bright person. I actually think Nnamdi Kanu is a much more dangerous political secessionist than Simon Ekpa. So I wouldn't be worried about him. What I'll be worried about is that the funding uh, pipeline that has somehow very curiously managed to shower Simon Ekpa and his people with hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars. I'd be very interested in knowing where that funding is coming from. Because even if Simon Ekpa disappears off the face of the planet tomorrow, that funding is still there. And it's going to find someone else and anoint that person as a new, and that person might be a more dangerous person. So um, I think there are foreign entities that are actively seeking to instigate crises that would lead to the not just the disintegration of Nigeria, but the violent disintegration of Nigeria. I think there are people who are actively working toward that. As I've said multiple times, even though personally I would very much prefer for Nigeria to remain one country, I think it's in Africa's best interest for Africa to have powerful, geographically large nation states. I think that's what's in Africa's best interest. However, if Nigeria were to break up because the people in Nigeria simply cannot find a way to get along and live together in any, acceptable manner, then so be it. But the issue is not so much the breakup, the issue is the manner of the breakup. Um, I would hope that if a breakup happens, that it's a negotiated breakup, something similar to the negotiations that led to the carving out of South Sudan, out of Sudan. Even though, yes, there was a war that came before that, but I'm saying the actual negotiation itself, there was a process involving the UN and all whatnot. So if that were to happen, if a breakup, which I don't want to happen really under any circumstances, but if a breakup absolutely had to happen, I would very much prefer that it were to be a negotiated breakup. Because if it were to be a violent disintegration, nobody's really going to survive it and nobody's going to recover from it. So even the new countries that would arise out of it, they wouldn't be able to recover from the mess that would that would arise from a violent disintegration. And the reason I say that is I don't think a lot of people understand. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about people not understanding that Nigeria is part of the world and Nigeria exists in a geopolitical context that is bigger than Nigeria. So a lot of people don't realize that some of the world's most abundant energy reserves that we don't even know, that we aren't even aware of, are buried under our feet in Nigeria. So the so-called Anambra Basin, for example, which covers parts of Imo, Ebonyi, and Anambra, is estimated to hold something like 30 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And to put that in perspective, the world's largest known reserves of natural gas currently are in Russia, which has about 40 trillion cubic feet. So that would put a region of Nigeria at number 2 globally. That's not the whole of Nigeria, that's a region of Nigeria at number 2 globally. Nigeria has so many other resources that most people aren't even aware of. So all the usual things, your coal, your iron ore, all this, obviously. But apart from those things, even things like nuclear fuel, uranium, Nigeria has these things. It's just that it's not, as we say, they're not allowed that. So if a violent disintegration is allowed to happen, with the number of global actors that are just circling around constantly looking for a way to sink their claws into, Nigeria is basically going to become Eastern DRC, or rather, what is left of Nigeria will become Eastern DRC, which is basically an everlasting civil war. And what's then going to happen is that if 6 countries emerge violently from what used to be known as Nigeria, within 2, 3 years, those 6 countries will start having their own internal secession movements because those same foreign interests they're not going to leave you alone simply because Nigeria is over. They're going to keep on fomenting that chaos. And unfortunately, even in the example that I mentioned, which is that of South Sudan, we have seen instances of this where, for no apparent reason, it just seems almost impossible for the South Sudanese to live at peace with each other. They're always fighting one civil war or the other. They don't have 5 unbroken years of peace and development. It just hasn't happened, right? So there is a puppet master behind the scenes, and it's very important for Nigerians to understand this, that Nigeria is not an island hanging in the air somewhere. That Nigeria is part of global geopolitics, and there are people who have an interest in sinking their teeth into Nigeria and not for the benefit of anybody in Nigeria. So, regardless of how much we do not like ourselves, and I know we don't like ourselves, but the fact is we don't have to like ourselves. We just have to find a way to coexist because the alternative can always be worse.
Thank you so much. So I'm bringing in people two at a time. So you ask your question or a comment, just one. Please don't go beyond one question. We don't have a lot of time with him. So I'll start with you, the flagship.
Thank you, Rudolph. And good afternoon, David. It's good to meet you. Can you hear me?
It's good to meet you too. Yes.
Oh, good, good. So, here's my. By the way, thank you for your submissions today. Quite educative and informative. Here's my question. In Trump's second bid for the White House that he failed in, there was a picture that came out from one of his campaign meetings where Nnamdi Kanu was seen. And it was said that he had been invited by a senator from Ohio who allegedly has a relationship with the now appointed chief of staff for Trump, Wise. My question is this: do you think that with Trump getting into office, that some way, somehow, this would facilitate the release of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu from detention?
To be honest, not really, because again, from the point of if you were Trump, what is in it for you? Trump doesn't really care either way. So maybe if the Tinubu administration were put under a specific type of pressure, maybe if the arguments were made successfully to a Trump administration that the continued detention of this guy somehow harms America's interest in Nigeria, then maybe the Trump administration might be interested in that. But to be honest with you, I don't particularly see a situation where the Trump administration is that interested. I think the so-called indigenous people of Biafra have very successfully sold the narrative that there's this they have some support in some places or something. And while they definitely do have some support by some sort of clandestine foreign intelligence actors, I don't think they have that sort of political cover the way they always claim that they do. So, to be honest, I think what is likely to happen is that the Tinubu administration will keep on holding on to Nnamdi Kanu and using him as a sort of, I don't know, baits or local leverage to sort of as you may be aware, the Tinubu administration is very fixated on the idea that its primary tool for maintaining the current economic balance, the current political balance in Nigeria, is by using the so-called Igbo race as a whipping boy. And a key part of that strategy is to hold Nnamdi Kanu in custody and say, hey, we have your golden child and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So I don't see why that would change in the short term, right? So except Trump were to do something similar to what he did in 2016 that spooked Buhari, where Buhari went for a state visit and he said, why are you killing Christians? And, that actually spooked the Buhari government enough to actually, pretend to start paying some attention to the security issues in the Middle Belt at the time. Except something similar to that happens, I don't see why that would be the case. I don't think Trump is actually going to pay that much attention to the Tinubu government, to be honest.
The reason I mentioned that is that there's alleged to be a meeting that was had yesterday in Abuja. And from what they said, the discussion revolved around a possible influence by Wiles with reference to Nnamdi Kanu's detention. So they're trying to see how they could figure a way to lobby and get in there to ensure that they still maintain the status quo as it is.
Well, I mean, it's one thing anyone can pay for a lobbyist on Capitol Hill. So the fact of any group of people being able to pay $45,000 to a registered foreign agent who goes to serve as a lobbyist at Capitol Hill does not in and of itself mean that that lobbyist is going to get the result that is being lobbied for. The job of a lobbyist is to try. It's not necessarily to accomplish something. So again, except there's a pressing geopolitical purpose for it, I don't necessarily see why it would happen that way.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, flagship. Let's go to Mr. James.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. David, for coming. I don't have any questions for you, but I want to seek your your opinion on something. We all know that in Africa, to the best of my knowledge, there has been no case of a foreign spy arrested in Africa, the way Russians are arrested in the West, and what's it called, the Westerners, they are arrested in Russia. There's nothing like that in Africa. My opinion is this. African academics, university lecturers, they seem not to know where to draw the line between their professional duties and other things, like espionage. Because what I notice is, if, let's say, the US government want to know what is happening between an African head of state and his wife in their bedroom at 12 midnight, they go to universities and offer them some pittance in form of consultancies or whatever you, and these guys do the dirty jobs and submit the report. This is happening all over Africa. I do not know if I'm correct, because this is what I'm suspecting. As an investigative journalist, may I please know your sincere opinion? Thank you.
Well, I mean, so you're not wrong about that, and it's actually quite a well-known or a publicized policy of not just the U.S. government, but any governments with significant intelligence, foreign intelligence capacity. Um, the primary way of gathering intelligence, unlike most people think, is not by sending in James Bond. It's not by sending in a spy. Like those people, those trained foreign intelligence agents are they're actually not that many. The primary means of sourcing intelligence from a foreign country is by using the people in that country and using them as assets, cultivating them as assets. So in Nigeria, that's everybody. That's journalists. A lot of journalists are cultivated as foreign assets in Nigeria, which you may or may not know. It's done to university lecturers. It's done to politicians. So, I mean, I can speak for myself. I, as you may or may not know, I used to be very chummy with the Americans back when I was based in Nigeria. In fact, in 2018, I was nominated for the International Visitors Leadership Program by the State Department. Right, that was when I was working at Channels TV. I was always getting invited to one event or the other at the U.S. Consular General's house in Ikoyi. And what would happen at those events is that one of these people, they'll call them cultural attaches. By the way, if you see someone at an embassy whose job title is cultural attache, that person is a spy, right? That person is a foreign intelligence agent. That's actually what they're doing there. But anyway, that's by the way. So this cultural attache with no well-defined job description will then start to engage you in conversation, very deep conversation, very meaningful conversation, and who basically debrief you, basically ask you questions about everything within your domain of knowledge about the country. And if you don't understand that you are talking to a CIA agent whose job it is to get information and write a report at the end of that evening, you would think you are having a sincere conversation with an intelligent person who is interested in what's happening in your country and maybe who wants to help or something. Meanwhile, they are just juicing you for information and you are being cultivated as an asset. That's the purpose of cultivating that relationship with you. That was done to me. That was done to several people that I know in my space. So no, you're absolutely not wrong. That is a thing that is done not just in the academic space, but in every space that foreign intelligence agencies have access to in a country. It's their job to cultivate locals, to basically give them all the information that they need. In fact, it's cheaper and more effective to gain information that way than to send one special agent so and so to go in and do some James Bond tactics. Nobody really works like that anymore. That was like Cold War era that things like that used to happen. And by the way, I'll just also correct the impression that it doesn't happen in Africa that spies get arrested. Maybe it doesn't happen anymore, but it used to happen. In Ghana, for example, I don't know if you're aware of.
Yes, I'm aware. There was an exchange of
Yeah,
spies during
yes,
Jerry
exactly.
Rawlings' time. I remember.
During Jerry Rawlings' tenure, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and what led to that was there was a guy, his name was his surname was Susudis. I don't remember his first name, unfortunately. So he was a Ghanaian spy who made friends with someone at the US Embassy in Ghana who happened to be the CIA station chief in Ghana. He made friends with her, i.e., they started sleeping together. And over the course of several years, because of that sexual relationship, he gained access to very, highly classified information, including information about U.S. Assets in Ghana, U.S. assets in like Cuba and other places. And the Ghanaian government was even sharing information with the Soviet Union and with Cuba and with other places as a result of that. So, and when the whole thing happened, when the whole thing was finally exposed, that station chief in Ghana was actually sent back to the US and she was jailed. So yeah, that's, maybe that doesn't happen anymore. Maybe our intelligence apparatus isn't that ambitious anymore. But once upon a time, that used to be the reality.
All right. Thank you, Mr. James.
Okay, I'm going home. It's already midnight. It's nearing midnight now.
All right. Thank you.
Signing out. Yeah. Thank you so much indeed.
All right. So let's go to Moye's turn.
Hi, Mr. Dr. Damages. Thank you for the show. David, thank you so much. I have to say that you're a hero, even though, you're a hero to many, many, many of us. Really appreciate the work that you're doing. In case you haven't heard it today, you are treasured. Okay. We respect what you're doing for your courage, for your boldness, for the audacity that you have. So please be encouraged. And some of us are back here rooting for you. Now, to my question, right? I'm sure maybe you have alluded to it at some point. It's in the area of the national media that we have in Nigeria. So as you know, I'm sure we don't have any media that tells it like it is in Nigeria. We don't have investigative journalists doing the real work, right? Of course, because we know we're well aware of the danger and all of that. So my question is, how, right? Do you have any idea of how we can, create our own media to be able to tell our stories as it should be told so we can, fight some of these things back? I don't know what you have to say to that, but that's a huge concern for me because what I find is that a lot of the news being translated to Nigerians in Nigeria, it's whitewashed most of the time. And some of it, or most of it, is misinformation. So a lot of people on ground, and there's even no light to even listen to the news. So I want to hear your thoughts on that.
So again, one of if you like, the experiments that I set out to um, to action with West Africa Weekly, when I started it off as a Substack newsletter, was to I always used to refer to it as Okada for journalism, and what I meant by that was I felt as if the traditional means for getting information across to Nigerians, first of all, they simply didn't work anymore. So traditionally, you would print a broadsheet newspaper, or you'd have a radio station or a TV station, and that was how Nigerians would access information. But nowadays, where statistically most, not just in Nigeria, but most people access information primarily from their smartphones. In some cases, only from their smartphones, above anything else. All those things have become obsolete. And then you have online newspapers, which are trying to fill in that gap, but you know, as you mentioned, they are captured. Most of them are foreign sponsored, likes of Premium Times, funded by Media Network and whatnot. So it's not doing the job either. So one of the experiments that I set out to do with West Africa Weekly was to even rethink um how information is passed across to Nigerians. That does there have to be this formal thing called a news medium, a newspaper, where you write a story that has the five W's and the H, and do things have to follow this method for information to be passed across to Nigerians? Why I called it Okada for journalism is using the analogy of how the Okada. I don't know if they're still banned in Lagos, but back when I used to live in Nigeria, they weren't banned. So when there's like traffic in Lagos and all the big cars are stuck in traffic, they're not moving anywhere. You come out and you get on the Okada and it just dodges and weaves through traffic and you get to your destination on time. That was what I was trying to do with West Africa Weekly. So I intentionally set out to break as many rules as I needed to. So, which is why many people, for one thing, for the longest time, my biggest criticism was that I'm not a real journalist, because apparently, what a real journalist is supposed to look and sound a certain way. The stories are supposed to be put together in a certain way. They're supposed to put together that be constructed a certain way, and people are supposed to read and interpret the story a certain way. But instead of doing things that way, I went in a completely different direction than what they had done before. So I mixed genres, for example. So print and video, visual journalism, I mixed the two because I don't see why they have to be distinct genres. So why does documentary making have to be a separate form of journalism from writing? The two are linked. So, that was what I set out to do with West Africa Weekly, and I think it had some success. I wouldn't say it's necessarily validated the thoughts that I had, but it had some success. And what I've come to understand, it goes back to what I was speaking to Rudolf about earlier, is that the basic problem we have in Nigerian media is that nobody's funding it. I think if there was enough of funding infrastructure, then more people like myself, younger people than me, would have come out and would have figured out how to pass these messages across, how to um how to introduce news to Nigerians. Because I think till today, one of the biggest roadblock that I have and that other people like me have with trying to inform Nigerians is that there's a significant proportion of Nigerians who can read, they're literate, they can read and write, they can understand information, but they just can't process it in the way that it's presented to them. So if you tweet a link, like this is an article, so you tweet the link of the article at these people, 90% of the time they're not even going to click on the link. If they do click on it, maybe they won't make it past the second paragraph. If they read the whole thing, they might not comprehend it properly. So there's a real problem with accessing and processing information, even in an age where there is infinite information. So what it is exactly that needs to be done to sort of package information in a new way that actually gets to audiences at their point of need. That is a whole new type of experimentation that will require a lot of time and money. Maybe we have some time, money we absolutely do not have. So, I mean, in my little space, I keep trying to do whatever experiments that I can. But I must say, what I'm doing is it's a drop in a bucket. Like there needs to be 30 organizations like West Africa Weekly doing different things, trying to experiment and trying to expose Nigerians to information. Because you're very right in saying that Nigerians are only exposed to someone else's version of events, someone else's story, often which is completely false, and they just don't know any better. So I look forward to a time when um, we will be able to have this conversation, and I'll be able to give you an answer that this and this has been done, and it's not just hypotheticals.
Okay, just really quickly, Dr. Damages, it's not a question. Just to add on to that, right, David, like, I don't know what your idea of transistor, I don't know what you think of transistor radios, and eventually, and how we can, if there's a way we can do like a space to call for support, because I follow your Africa Weekly, for instance. So if there's anything we can do, I think we need to continue to call for donations so people can understand the importance of having this media and how we can get it to the grassroots in the different dialects that we have. That's all. Thank you very much, Dr. Damages.
All right. Thank you, Amoye. David, if you are watching, there's a question that I want to, it's from the comment section. Okay, you're back. The question says, I'm having a problem. Okay, good. Now the question says, hold on, let me get it. He said, do you think Trump has the same relation with Crown Prince of Saudi as Obama and Biden? Do you think Brits and Saudi are for the cabal? Therefore, no change with Trump.
So I have no way of knowing what Trump's relationship is with the Saudis. I'm not going to pretend that I know. I simply don't know. But from the little that I know, Saudi Arabia is 100% a US ally, and that is not likely to change. I think any noises we hear about Saudi Arabia moving toward the BRICS is just noise. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think the Saudis there has been more than half a century of very, very, very close diplomatic collaboration between Saudi Arabia and the US. So I definitely don't think the Saudis are ever, not going to be a US ally. Saudi Arabia is a founding member of the American world empire. Let me just put it that way, right? The prevalence or the dominance of the US dollar in the global financial system is entirely built on Saudi Arabia. The so-called petrodollar was a deal that was put together by the Saudi king and US President Richard Nixon in the 70s. It's an actual thing. So it's not in the interest of the Saudis for the US empire to end. So no, the Saudis are definitely very much outside of the US. However, the BRICS, on the other hand, that's a more complicated conversation. I think they're definitely BRICS members. There are many BRICS members that are diametrically opposed to US dominance. So the likes of China, Iran, those people definitely have a vested interest in, supplanting the existing world order. But I think even within those so-called BRICS member states, there are some that swing both ways. So, like Brazil, for example, I am not convinced that Brazil is anything but a US client state, right? So, I think the only reason that Brazil is part of the BRICS is because, well, what the BRICS initially started off as was an alliance of big economies in the global south. I think that's why Brazil was so sort of included by default. But I think Brazil is a US client state, and I don't see a situation where Brazil is suddenly going to become, like Russia or China, like like trying to replace the US in the world order. I just don't see it happening. So again, I'm very cautious about the BRICS. I would love to see a multipolar world happen in my lifetime, but I'm not entirely convinced that the BRICS is going to be the vehicle through which it will happen.
No, I'm sorry, David. I think there's a correction. He actually meant Brits, like Britain, not BRICS.
Okay. I
Britain
had
and Saudi
BRICS.
Arabia are they for the cabal? That's what he meant.
Are you asking whether the British government is for the US cabal?
No. The
That's
cabal
a
in
statement.
Nigeria. I think he's talking about Nigeria.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
so he's asking whether the Saudis
The
and the British
Saudis.
government
Yeah, the
are
British
are in
government.
lockstep with the Nigerian government.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't think the Saudis have an especially strong opinion on what Nigeria should or shouldn't be, because I think the primary
Interest.
convergence that the Saudi government has, the primary interest that the Saudi government has with Nigeria is the Islamic relationship within Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. It's not much of a trading relationship, and it's definitely not oil. Nigeria and Saudi Arabia are both major oil exporters. So technically they're actually competitors. So the only real point of commonality between both, and the only thing that has been a historical point of convergence for them, is the fact that northern Nigeria is heavily dominated by a brand of Islam that was directly exported from Saudi Arabia in the 50s, and that over the past half century, Saudi Arabia has been actively, using state sponsorship to push that version of Sunni Islam in Nigeria. So beyond that, I don't think the Saudis have an especially strong opinion. The Brits, on the other hand, I think we know exactly where the British government stands. To be fair to them, they don't pretend about it either. The British government is fully in lockstep with everything, everything that represents the status quo in Nigeria. The British government has a finger in it somewhere.
All right. Thank you. Let's go to Tony. Tony, you are next.
Thank you, Doctor. Greetings, David. I want to start first by thanking you for the very instructive and information that you have given here at on the panel. But I have a personal question for you, if you don't mind. And given the way, the path that you have chosen in your journalistic career, how do you feel? Is this a natural path that you had proposed, a career path that you had proposed to follow? Given the fact that as you walk this path, you are constantly probably looking behind you to see, who is. I'm talking about safety issues now, your personal safety. I recall that sometime you were in one of the African countries and there were issues about your safety and so on and so forth. But fortunately, you were able to get out of it to safety. So how have you been able to cope, given the issues that are surrounding some of your journalistic investigative work that you have done? Thank you.
So first of all, I think I wouldn't say it's anything like it's like a calling or anything like that. I think it's more as my understanding of the world evolved, then I had to make a choice that I either go along with the status quo and manage the reality, the disappointing reality of the world that I grew up into, or I decide to take action and do something that I think could possibly change it. And me being being the strong head that I am, I decided that I didn't want to accept it. I wanted to do something to change it. So again, that's why I don't see myself as a victim or a hero or anything. I made a choice. I knew what I was getting myself into. I understood the risks that were inherent in what I was getting myself into. I grew up in a family that is part of the Nigerian establishment, right? So I understand what Nigeria does to people who make trouble. I wasn't naive about any of this. So no, I don't see it as like some grand calling or something that was thrust on me. I see it as I made a decision that I wanted to try and change something because Nigeria took Nigeria took things from me that I wasn't prepared to keep losing. Specifically my dad. When he died in 2017, that was really the trigger for all of this because that was when I realized that there's really no way to get away from it. No matter how economically comfortable you've built your existence to be, no matter how insulated you think you are, you're not insulated. There's nobody in Nigeria who is not poor. Even if you have $1 billion in the bank, you are a poor man if you are physically located in Nigeria, because Nigeria is a geographically poor area. It's something as simple as an ambulance or the lack of it can kill you in Nigeria. That's what killed my dad. Right? My dad was not a poor man, but it was just the fact that an ambulance needed to show up and it didn't show up. And that's how he just died randomly for no reason. And I wasn't prepared to continue going on with a situation where like you live in a country that is like every day you get out of bed, you are gambling. Especially being that I've traveled significantly, I've seen better and I wanted better. And at the same time, even though I wanted better, I didn't want to leave my country. I didn't want to leave Africa and go live in Canada or live in the UK for the rest of my life. I believe that it's possible to have that better and to have it where I was born. So whatever it is that is stopping that better from happening to the place where I was born, me and that thing were going to fight. So that's how I see things. I see it in a very black and white way. And honestly, I don't understand people who don't see it the same way, to be honest. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Let's go to Jide. Jide, the next.
Thank you so excuse me. Thank you so much, Dr. Damages. Thank you so much, David, for everything. Thank you so much for being resilient, for this struggle. Thank you so much. I don't know what else I can say. But I don't take a lot of time. So real quick, thank you so much. And your struggle is our struggle, even those in the diaspora. all of us, your struggle is our struggle, trust me. And you are stronger than you think, trust me. Okay, now to my question. You said a lot of things, particularly the geopolitics of the election of Donald Trump. You made a lot of interesting analysis. Very interesting. I learned some things. Actually, I disagree with certain things. I disagree with certain aspects of your analysis. And when I disagree, maybe when I ask my question, you understand better. So you talk about Donald Trump coming in and reversing a lot of the policy of the Democrats. I'm not sure that is the case. I think I don't think that's not actually the case, in my opinion. So the way it works is the Republicans and the Democrats, they still implement the same foreign policy all over the world in different dynamics. So Democrats under Joe Biden, to be quick, under Joe Biden, Putin invaded Ukraine, right? Russia invaded Ukraine due to NATO interference and other factors, right? The attack of ethnic Russians. Actually, when Donald Trump was in power, that was when NATO started to fund the Ukrainian government, supply them with military support and everything, before Joe Biden actually came to power. So that was actually what facilitated the invasion of Ukraine. The Abraham Accords in the Middle East and the removal of the nuclear deal with Iran. That was one of the major reasons that facilitated the instability that we're seeing right now in the Middle East. So it's a continuation. So now with the fact that the US and the collective West are tied in Ukraine, and there's been an obvious failure, right? There have to be a way out. And one of the way out was there have to be an alternative, which is the Republicans. I don't want to go into more details. Like the Republicans have to come and save the grace. So my question now is, for Africa, the foreign policy has remained the same. There are some dynamics that go on, events, there are a lot of changes that go on in Africa, whoever is in power, the Democrats or the Republicans. But I realized that the policy still remains the same. Even when Trump was in power the last time, Libya was still under destruction. Look at what happened in Syria. The same policy was implemented in Syria, what they did in Libya, but they failed because they couldn't oust Bashar al-Assad. So it's still the same policy, but in different dynamics. They know how to play the game. It's more of like a psyop to make you feel like, oh, one is less of an evil, right? So in my opinion, I don't think it's draining the swamp. I think it's just going to be a different dynamic, but it's still going to be the same. But however, the positive thing about Trump is I think it's going to make us want to fend for ourselves more in Africa. So my question for you real quick is, how do you think, what do you think is going to change? How do you think Nigeria can resist this aggressive foreign policy to our advantage? Thank you.
All right.
So first of all, yeah, so you're not wrong in saying that the US government is a continuum across Republican and Democrats, which is why I said the wild card is not the fact that the Republicans are coming into power. The wild card is the fact that Trump is coming into power, because even for a Republican, Trump is a bit of a maverick. Now, during Trump's last term, as you rightly said, there were things that were happening behind the scenes that directly led to some of the things we're seeing now. However, what you would have also noticed is that the people who were responsible for those things, people like Mike Pompeo, the then Secretary of State, Trump put out a tweet yesterday saying that Mike Pompeo and Susan Newland will not be part of his government. Thank you and goodbye. So my interpretation of that is that Trump has understood that even though he thought he was in charge between 2016 and 2020, there were parts of the so-called swamp that he was really not controlling, and that the people he trusted to run were doing their own things which were continuations of Obama and George Bush policy, which he didn't necessarily agree with. So I suspect, or I think, that his coming term, he has declared a full war on the so-called deep state, which is why I'm very excited about the prospects for Africa. Not because I think Trump is a good person, not because I think he's going to be a good president, not because I think anything positive of Trump. I think it's very important to make that clear. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is going to be some sort of JFK anti-war president. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that his ego has taken a very huge hit. He has realized that during his last administration, there were people that he gave jobs to in that administration who were actually working at cross purposes with what he thought he was doing. And that the Obama administration that he thought he had so successfully defeated by defeating Hillary Clinton continued behind the scenes in some ways. And that in some ways, that is what contributed to getting him kicked out of power in 2020, like under his own nose. So his ego has taken a huge beating and he has a grudge. So his entire thing this term, if you look through it, since he was declared winner from then till now, all his tweets, look through everything, the only thing he's talking about is revenge in some form or the other. That man is coming here to start war within the US government. So the way I see it is that, I mean, if you're in America, it's probably bad news for you because it's probably going to be 4 years of just upheaval of all kinds. It's probably not, especially if you're a black person in America, it's probably not going to be a good time. But I'm looking at it strictly from a continental African point of view, that the opportunity here for us is that this man is going to be busy setting so many fires within all these apparatus of states, many of which are directly used to interfere in Africa, that we on the continent, specifically in places like Nigeria and Kenya, if I mean, there are some things I want to say, but at the same time, I don't want to say because I mean, now that I've already been accused of treason, let me not go and load more coals on top of my head. But let's just say that if an enterprising person, of a certain, of a certain disposition, were to seize the opportunity now and do something, I don't know what that something is. It could be an election, it could be a revolution, it could be whatever it is. I don't know. But if that moment were to be seized and something were to be done to kick out the existing puppets we have in place, the political cover that those puppets currently enjoy from the Obama, Biden people, Clinton people, they are not going to enjoy that political cover anymore. I'm looking specifically at Bola Tinubu and William Ruto. Those are the two most immediate candidates in my eyes. Those are two people who wouldn't be in office right now if the US State Department did not want them to be there. William Ruto specifically is somebody who, even after being elected, with all the chaos that went on earlier in the year in Kenya, there is no reason why William Ruto should still be the president. As I was telling Dr. Damages earlier, between July and now, the entire Kenyan government has changed. The entire cabinet has changed. The vice president, the only person who is still there is William Ruto. And the only reason he's still there is because the US ambassador wants him to be there. The US ambassador is basically the de facto head of state in Kenya, not the Kenyan president. But now that Trump is going to set everywhere on fire, because Trump doesn't care about maintaining order or keeping things running. Trump wants to disrupt everything. He wants everybody to suffer the way they made him suffer. He has a personal grudge. He believes they tried to kill him twice. They put his face on a police mugshot. They disgraced him thoroughly. And to be fair, they actually disgraced him thoroughly. They ran him through the mud. And now he has done this spectacular political comeback. The only thing inside that old man's head is revenge. That everybody who wronged me, I'm going to make you regret it. You saw recently, I think it was yesterday, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, has already said that he's going to resign before Trump gets inaugurated.
Right.
They've already started running away. So I'm not banking on Trump being a good president for anybody. No. What I'm banking on is him being a terrible president, actually. That's actually what I'm banking on, that he's going to start so many fires and cause so much chaos. Remember the last time when he was president and there was a government shutdown? Yeah, there will be more things like that. That's what I'm banking on, because it's going to get to the point where they are going to be, I don't know if you saw this yesterday or 2 days ago, where it was revealed that there were meetings being held in the Pentagon where people present at the meetings where the meetings were on the subject of what do you do if the president, that is Trump, gives you an instruction that you don't agree with. So already people are already the idea is already being built within the American system that this new president is someone that we need to oppose. So there's going to be a civil war in the administration. That is what I'm banking on. Because when all of that, go on.
I think I agree. What you said, just to emphasize on that, with the previous administration of Trump, he did some very interesting things. Just to emphasize, thank you for the clarity. I was going to say the firing of John Bolton. When John Bolton was, I can't remember, I think he was Secretary of State or so, or his security advisor or something. John Bolton actually wanted the war with Iran. He fired him. I think that was what actually facilitated the removal of the nuclear deal. Then John Bolton literally wanted the US to actually go and declare a war, official war with Iran. Yeah. But he didn't do that. He was wise enough to manage the risk So he instead went for one of their security advisor or something by killing Qasem Soleimani. But yeah, you are very right. There's a way he plays the game. There's a way he actually plays.
All right. Thank you, Jide. We have to move on. Righteous Man, you're next. Righteous Man, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I said, David Hundeyin, I greet you from Lagos, and I pray a prayer for you that the hand that brought you into this world will preserve you from all evil and deliver you from every wickedness of man against your life. That's my prayer for you. You've done so well. We are proud of you, and your work will outlive you from generation to generation. In Jesus' name. And now, just one question. Please, what do you think that the likes of, from your analysis, from your expositions, I have come to realize that some individuals are bought over to inform the Western powers of the activities going on in their country. Maybe it could be individual, maybe it could be the corporate state. Now, what do you think about the likes of Reno Omokore? And again, what do you think that made Peter Obi to lose 2023 general election, presidential election in Nigeria? Thank you.
What do I think of someone like Reno Mokri? I think, well, they're political jobbers all over the world. There's nothing new or nothing strange about him. After Reno Mokri, there will be others. Before him, we had the likes of Daniel Kanu during the days of Sani Abacha. There will be more after him. So there's nothing strange about him. People will always work for their bread. It is what it is. But the second question, which is what I'm more interested in, that why did Peter Obi lose the presidential election? Well, first of all, he didn't lose. That's just the objective fact. He didn't lose. However, the person who was declared winner had, first of all, had diplomatic support from the usual suspects, and in the local context, had the ability to move pieces around on the chessboard. He had the ability to get people to do certain actions on his behalf. So even according to the official numbers, which I think is always very instructive to look at them. So the official numbers released by INEC have it that more than 60% of the electorate voted for candidates whose name was not Bola Tinubu. So in the real sense of it, Bola Tinubu did not win a popular mandate. You understand? And these are by the official INEC figures, which, as you know, were heavily manipulated. But even by the official figures, they weren't able to create a scenario where Tinubu won the election, because he didn't. So on the issue with Peter Obi isn't a political issue. It's not that there was a lack of votes or there was a lack of campaigning or whatever. At the ballot box, he won the election. The issue is that in Nigeria, winning an election and being declared the winner of an election are not the same thing. And that winning the election is only the first step on the road to being declared winner of an election. And that to be declared the winner of an election, you need to be willing to fight. You need to be really willing to go the whole distance, which I don't think Peter Obi is ready to do. Because again, Peter Obi he's someone I like and respect a lot personally, but the reality is he's a member of the Nigerian establishment. He's not going to be the person who is going to tell people to go out into the streets and burn everything down. Because if you burn everything down, some of the things that we burn down are his own things too. It's not in his interest for him to tell you, go out and, burn stuff down. He's a billionaire. He's an industrialist. So it is what it is. So it needed to be the people themselves who sort of took a hint and did that, because it was never going to be him who would do that. So I think that's what the issue was. I think the people were waiting for some charismatic rallying figure to tell them to go out and resist. But that was never going to happen, because Peter Obi is not that guy. Peter Obi is a competent administrator, but he's not a charismatic politician. I mean, he might be perceived as charismatic because of what he represents, but in terms of his actual interaction with the people, He's just like a regular down to earth guy. He's not the one who he doesn't have that um he doesn't think that his ambition is worth spilling blood for. And that's the difference between him and the people who win elections in Nigeria. The people who win elections in Nigeria think that their ambition is worth everything. So maybe that's the takeaway from 2023, that whoever it is that is going to successfully unseat the oligarchy needs to be ready to do some unexpected things.
All right. Thank you, righteous man. Let's go to Victory. And Odi will be the last person.
Thank you, Dr. Damage, and thank you, David, for coming on the show. Um, David, I once did a deep reflection, and I wrote a piece called "Nigeria, a Country of Adults Suffering from the Perversion of the Mind and Learning Disabilities." And this ties down to the aspect of what you said about it's like a lot of Nigerians don't have comprehension. They might read something, but it's like they don't even understand what they are reading, or they can't understand the environment, or they can't understand the risk factor that is looking at them in their faces. And then this tied down to the whole point of when you talked about funding for journalism, that there's lots of Nigerian elites that are billionaires, and they don't seem to understand the connection between funding journalism for a better country. Rather, they are just pursuing their own selfish interest. So my question is that why is it that Nigerians, even in the diaspora, will mourn and will complain? But if you tell them to come together and just even donate 30 pounds every month to fund a system and a proper journalism system that will put pressure on the government, they won't do that. They will just complain and complain and complain online. But just tell them to put something as little as 30 pounds or maybe $30 towards a proper system that can put pressure on the government in terms of like reporting the news as it is, creating awareness. They won't do that, but they will just whine and whine and whine. Do you think we as a people would lack collective critical thinking? What do you think it is?
I think it's more than just lacking collective critical thinking. I think it's also lacking a history of collective action, a history of uniting to do anything really. I actually analyzed this a few months ago where I drew this back as far back as the colonial period, where I said that pretty much every other major African country had an actual anti-colonial struggle or anti-colonial war. So those people in those countries have some sort of memory of a time when everybody came together to do something that everybody wanted to do. In Nigeria, we didn't really have an anti-colonial struggle. We achieved independence through voting in parliament. The regular people on the streets, apart from a few isolated incidents, which we like to tell ourselves were part of an anti-colonial movement, like, about women's rights and whatnot. But those things were anti-colonial, were localized anti-colonial expressions of anger. And it wasn't even expressions of anger against the entire colonial system. It was about specific parts of it, like taxation. So Nigerians really have no history of unifying collectively to do anything. And even the independence that we got, the first time the motion for independence was moved in Nigeria's parliament, half of the country voted against it. These are historical facts. So I think just generally Nigerians lack a history of collective action. Nigerians do, and because of that lack of collective action, Nigerians don't understand that we actually have the power to get anything done. So I've said this several times that the people holding Nigeria down, they are fewer than 1,000 people. Because even the so-called police and army and whatnot, they are also part of the downtrodden. The actual people holding Nigeria down, they are fewer than 1,000 people in Abuja and Lagos. They are not that many, and there are about 200 million Nigerians. But those 200 million Nigerians don't understand that it's possible for the many to rise up against the few and get something done. They don't even realize that it's possible. As you said, something as simple as funding something that will put a proper amount of pressure on the government. And I know this because I've spent how many years now until I gave up last year and I took investments to try and keep the platform running. I spent 3 years trying to run what was at the time West Africa's biggest subscription funded investigative journalism platform. And I had, at its peak, he had something like 55,000 subscribers, which sounds like a lot. But of those 55,000, there were fewer than 150 who had ever paid. I didn't say who were paying. I said who had ever paid, including those who had stopped paying after a while and everything. So, it was like a labor of love because all the while I was running West Africa Weekly as a subscription platform, I was working a day job as well to fund it. I still work a day job, in addition to running West Africa Weekly on the side. I don't get a salary from it. It's a labor of love that I'm doing pretty much because I believe that there needs to be an alternative to the mainstream nonsense that is being pumped into the heads of Nigerians. I believe that it's a disaster for a country of 200 million people to have no alternative media. That you only have a media that is tightly controlled and then social media noise, and there's nothing in between. I think that's a disaster. So that's what I think I'm trying to do with West Africa Wiki. But I have a day job. I'm a project manager. I work in tech. So you're not wrong in saying that Nigerians have a sort of deficits, not just in critical thinking, but in just generally coming together to do things. This is not even a financial issue because I was very explicit from the start that I don't expect Nigerians living in Nigeria to be able to afford monthly subscriptions. $10 a month is a lot for a Nigerian living in Nigeria. I understand that. So nobody's expecting them to be able to do that. I'm talking about Nigerians in the diaspora who are well settled, who can easily afford these things. And even at that level, they just can't see the need for it. They can't. However, you watch, maybe there's some Nigerian community in Canada or UK or wherever, Germany, maybe somebody dies and they need to like crowdfund to do a funeral or send the body back to Nigeria. And then you see people raising 30,000, 60,000 euros in a few minutes. And it's like, okay, so you people do know how to crowdfund things, just not the important things. Well, that's okay. I guess we'll get what we deserve eventually.
So why do you think that's the case then?
Well, apart from the two factors that I've already said, I think also, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, I think culturally, across most Nigerian cultures, we have an inability to set priorities. Again, it gives me no pleasure to say this because saying this sounds very suspiciously close to, that racist caricature of the Nigerian native that was painted by Frederick Lugard, where he described us as happy, excitable, thriftless person that is half devil, half child. That characterization that he gave of us, unfortunately, there are some parts of that characterization that hit very close to home. We have this inability to set priorities, to sort of add 2 plus 2 and get 4, and think in a straight line. Well, always sort of, we have this like paralyzing inability to process information and, arrive at a reasonable conclusion. We're always sort of going off on a tangent and getting lost in our own nonsense. So that's the only explanation I can think of apart from the other two things that I've said, because again, I've had this conversation so many times, and I even put it out there several times. And every time I put it out there, people say, "No, you're generalizing. If you do a GoFundMe, we'll do this, we'll do that." And basically, what it is that people want you to beg. You want to help them, but they want you to beg them to help them. And then even if you do beg, they won't still do it. So here we are.
All right, thank you, Victory, and Odi.
Hi, David. It's a pleasure to talk to you directly, and thank you for sharing your knowledge over the past, few years. And I've really learned a lot from you about Nigeria, where we come from. And I just have one question for you, but I just wanted to pivot back to what the other panelists had said on your comment. Personally, I've never really been exposed to, let's say, subscription on West African Weekly or any of your platforms. I think also your team, instead of you bearing the brunt on your own, you can also get folks to be able to give exposure to this. Not begging. I don't think you've done. I think even if you beg, if it's not beneath what you've done, you've risked your life. So because I think if you're able to expose these platforms that are safe, that where people can commit whatever and know that they can do it safely without being chased down by someone, people will respond, and there's a lot of exposure and knowledge coming from folks like you. and others that have been coming on the platform and in other social media. And before we were very controlled by the few media we had. Now there's a lot of exposure. So I think you should rethink that also. Even you being here today, you can commit for us and say, hey, this is a link where you can go and subscribe to. This should be that. I think that should be the first. Advertise yourself, and people will be able to support your cause because we love you. Many people do actually. But going back to my question, is who is Lakaruas, and the and what's their relationship to what's going on in Niger? Recently, and knowing your history with what happened, what was going to happen in Niger, because my concern is, what happened, the war was going to be spooked between Nigeria and Niger. Essentially, you were at the forefront of kind of detonating that. But it looks like I thought that could have spooked the northern elite to abandon some of their old ways of doing business and their alliances and friendship to join really the fight to rescue Nigeria. But that didn't happen. And I'm wondering if this group may do it, to say, hey, because I don't know the Amorphous, but I think you may have more knowledge than me. And also, I just wanted to know your thoughts, based on the maverick nature of Donald Trump. I think most of us agree that there will be some clarity problems about the world order because it's a nationalist, and most people would try to take advantage. Is there going to be? I think there will be an opportunity for us to move forward together. I agree with you in Nigeria that if we stay together, they were the best hope for the black man. It's not just for our tribes. And is there a way that we can take our best chance in your thought process within this next 1 to 2 years that is coming? Thank you.
So I'm trying to avoid falling into the trap of prescribing an action to take because I think there are several possible actions that can be taken. And in case there's anyone out there who is actually working on doing any of these things, I also don't want to like accidentally go and sort of open my big mouth and let the cat out of the bag. I think there are several routes that are possible. I think at this point, many of the what's the word I'm looking for? The assumptions that I personally once held about how Nigeria should ideally work. I think those assumptions have been thrown into the bin. I think many of the assumptions I once had about for example, the status of electoral democracy as the absolute gold standard for everything. I think a lot of these assumptions have been challenged over the past few years, and I've had to sort of look myself in the mirror and accept that I don't know as much as I once thought I did. It is what it is. So whatever it is, this intervention might be a political intervention. It might be something that comes by way of an election. Bear in mind, Nigeria's next election is in 2027. Some people are of the belief that this election happens in the middle of a sort of sweet spot when the Trump wildfire, if you like, should be at its peak, and the incumbent president should be at his most exposed, and that now is probably when a coalition in Nigeria, an opposition coalition, is best positioned to do something about it. Some have suggested that supposed coalition should be hiring all manner of lobbyists on Capitol Hill right now to take advantage of the supposed transactional nature of Donald Trump. Right? There are a lot of suggestions that have been made. So I think that whatever it is that people think needs to be that they should or that they can do, people should do. Right? I think the more the merrier. Because I think at this point we're well beyond sort of queuing up behind one big black hope. Like we need to sort of scatter our eggs across many baskets. So, and whichever one works out for us, the better. So, again, it could be through an election, it could be through some sort of revolutionary movement. However, that might materialize, I'm not sure. It might be a Kenya style thing. whatever it is, the only thing I can say for certain is that when I do see it, I will throw myself behind it 100% because I think we all want to see it happen.
La Curaras and Niger. La Curawas.
I was trying to restrain myself from saying that because again, I don't having words put in my mouth. Because then you hear a headline, hey, they're getting appropriate medical care. Yeah, I didn't say that. But again, at this point, every option is on the table. So whatever action it is that is necessary to take things, whoever wants to take it, whoever is in a position to take it. Hey, I'm not a factor for this situation.
All right, thank you. Your audio is not very clear towards the end, but I hope forefathers, one last question or comment, and then we're giving the
Yeah,
time.
thank you, Dr. Rudolph. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And greetings to everyone on the panel, and special greetings to David Hundeyin. I think you have been doing a good job. I don't know how you do it. I'm not sure how you still do it. And from all your contribution, I think you are on the right path. Regarding the question that was asked earlier on, why is it that our people don't do anything or support someone like you? One, I think it's because they think it's optional. They don't necessarily understand how essential this is to our very existence. And in terms of path forward, I believe that one of the issues we have is that we don't have a specific ideology that we all follow and that we sensitize the people on. The only ideology seems to be like corruption and poverty that we complain about, but we don't paint a picture of what the people should see and what they should be striving for. And given the work you are doing, you're already on your way there. Because from what I've read of other people that have led movements, like the Bolshevik, they do publications of their ideas, and but they had a coherent idea that they have to sell to the people. And once the people buy into that idea, the leaders have to fulfill it or they are removed. And that's what happened to the leaders in then Russia. So the question I wanted to ask is regarding there's also the your analysis on the geopolitical weather. Trump is more likely to be racial oriented in his politics, hence why he's more friendly with the Russians. And he's upsetting the Mackinder's this in the World Island thesis. I don't know if you have heard of it. So if he upsets it, this is one of the reasons why they consider him very dangerous. If he does that, the BRICS doesn't even have to do anything. The vision of the BRICS will come to fruition because Russia will become more powerful and Russia is close to China. America's power will weaken. So they don't even need the BRICS to do anything. And that is why America will do everything to stop, at least the Anglo-Saxons will do stuff to stop this thing, what Trump is trying to do. The question I wanted to ask you was about one, do you think an ideology is important for us to have to transform the system? Because then it's not depending on one individual. You're not one individual, then the ideology stands on its own. And at the core of our problem is our ability not to be able to defend ourselves. And do you see a way we can get to that even while these leaders are still in office? Like, using protests, calling them out on stuff and calling for accountability in terms of the level of insecurity in the country to nudge them in the right direction to do the right thing by the people. So those are the two questions I have: ideology and nudging them to secure our people, because that is where most of our compromise seems to be coming from.
Yeah, so absolutely, an ideology is actually the most important. Having an ideology is actually, in my opinion, is the most important step on the way to freeing your society, really. Because if not, then as you rightly said, you're occasionally blessed with one individual who is able to see the bigger picture, but the people around him can't see the same picture he's seeing, and you end up with a good luck Jonathan situation. Where till today, a significant, I would go as far as to say a majority of Nigerians don't actually even understand why the Goodluck Jonathan administration was actually taken out of power. And they don't understand that it had nothing to do with Goodluck Jonathan being a great president or being a corrupt president or whatever. It was a geopolitical tussle. That comes from having a basic lack of awareness about their place in the world and having a lack of ideology about where they want to be in the world. So, which is why if you ask a typical, an average Nigerian, what's the problem in Nigeria? He'll give you a very pedestrian answer like corruption or something, like an answer that is not really an answer that is just a symptom of the actual problem. Or you tell you that the problem of Nigeria is tribalism, is that they don't like Igbo people or something. Like these are symptoms, these are not the real issues. Having a knowledge of one's place in the world, a knowledge of history, geopolitics, and having an ideological framework that pulls all those things together and directs you to where you want to be in future, I think is the key to freeing your society. We definitely don't have that yet in Nigeria, and I think that's one of the reasons why this alternative media ecosystem, even shows like this, are part of that alternative information ecosystem. That's why they're so important, because nowhere else are Nigerians going to receive this type of education that they need. It's not on AIT or on Punch newspaper that they're going to get this. Right? Those platforms are only ever going to keep on feeding them with the same pedestrian nonsense they've always fed them. Right? So it is what it is. Now, your second question, which was about our ability to defend ourselves, just so I don't go off on a tangent here, was that, were you referring to self-defense on a national level, like a country being able to defend itself from hostile geopolitical forces, or like
Yes,
right,
influence and forces, yeah, and also internal security, because we are losing equivalent, from what I gather, to almost $50 billion annually due to insecurity, and nothing is being done about it.
So what I'm about to say, it will be, not everybody will like it. It's considered to be sort of heretical. It's considered to be heresy, especially in Pan-Africanist spaces, right? Because the received knowledge in Pan-African ideology is that Africa should develop as much as possible to do locally, and that Africa should restrict foreign involvement in as much of what it does as possible. However, I think the reality is that we live in a world where, in terms of military interference, in terms of sheer military capacity, there are certain countries that, on their own, have the capacity to destroy all of Africa, like one country. There are certain countries that have that capacity, and many of these countries are not on good terms with Africa. Many of these countries have interests that are diametrically opposed to the interests of Africa. So I think, given that that's the reality, I think this does not. I'm not suggesting that Africa should go then become somebody's vassal state because it's in opposition to somebody else. Because then you are just merely exchanging one master for another. We know that. However, as I was saying earlier to Dr. Damages, I feel like other countries have displayed that they are allowed to be transactional in their geopolitics. I think we are also allowed to be transactional. So I don't see any problem if, for example, there were to be a time-based defense arrangement with one of the big dogs that we feel like is not going to be problematic to us. So say Nigeria were to enter into a defense partnership with China, for example, and this were to be a time-based, a time-limited thing, that for the next X number of years, you will have access to so and so and so. Maybe you have access to use of a Nigerian port, which will give China access to a base in West Africa. And yeah, as I said, all of it sounds like heresy, but trust me, I'm getting somewhere with this. Like, for a limited period of time, you get this benefit that you want to get, and in return, during that time, we are not just building up our defenses in terms of buying weapons and recruiting soldiers and building stuff. We're also building our technical capacity, our industrial capacity, because really, how a country is able to defend itself in a military sense is by having a great industrial base. Because wars are won by production, really, not by soldiers. They are won by having a strong economy with a strong industrial base. So, like, the reason why China is eventually going to become the world's strongest military, if it's not already there, it's simply because it's the world's biggest producer of stuff. It has the capacity to produce literally everything. So, And I think that's what we currently don't have. I think we're actually on our way there a decade ago, if you recall, in during the dying embers of the Jonathan administration, when we were in talks with the Pakistani Air Force, I believe it was, no, the Pakistani Army, what's it called? People's Liberation Force, whatever it is. We were supposed to buy a squadron of the JF, was it JF-35, JF-40 Thunders, JF-35. And in addition to buying a squadron of those fighter jets, I think they were fourth generation fighter jets, the Pakistanis were also supposed to set up a what's the word, an assembly facility for those jets in Nigeria, which would have given us the capacity to produce more of those jets on our own and to maintain them. Because currently, one of the major problems with the Nigerian Army and the Nigerian Air Force is that we have a lot of equipment, which obviously we bought from Czech Republic, from Iran, from North Korea, from the US, from Italy, from France, from everywhere. And we can't maintain any of it. We don't have the capacity to maintain it. We don't have the industrial base. So once those things break down, they're just expensive pieces of metal sitting on the floor. So like our Air Force, for example, I think Nigerian Air Force has something like, we have the largest Air Force in Africa on paper, but it's completely useless because all of it is, I jokingly refer to it as the sanctions Air Force because most of it is like airframes that are like Italian or American or British or whatnot. And once those people pass one law or sanction you in one way, those airframes become expensive pieces of junk metal. You can't do anything with them. You can't fly them. Some of these equipments, every time you need to operate them, anytime you need to fly them, you need a code from the manufacturer, which is in the country of origin of the equipment. So it's completely useless to you in an actual war situation when you might need it, right? So, um, why Iran is successful with its self-defense policy is that 99% of what Iran does in its defense space is actually homegrown. It obviously buys foreign equipment from like Russia and China and elsewhere, but it domesticates everything. So, for example, the F-4 Phantom fighter jets that were bought under the Shah of Iran in the 1960s or 70s, Iran still has those F-4s and is able to maintain them locally. It has built up an entire supply chain to maintain these foreign-built jets locally, right? That's the capacity we don't have in Africa yet, and that's the capacity we need to build, like as a matter of urgency. Because presently, anytime Africa has security challenges, all we are constantly crying about is how so and so did not sell weapons to us. We don't actually manufacture these things. I mean, I know in Nigeria we have Daikon, so we make like AK-47s on that license. We make a few things here and there, but the actual heavy equipment, to the best of my knowledge, with the exception of South Africa and Egypt, there are no countries in Africa that actually make these things. So Africa is just constantly at the mercy of whatever external actor there is, which is how come Jonathan was successfully kicked out of office in 2014 because the push against Boko Haram couldn't be executed without, if you recall, at a point because of US sanctions, Nigeria had to use a private jet to move arms around, a private jet filled with cash, and it became a whole scandal because Nigeria couldn't officially purchase weapons because the US was, under the Obama presidency, was actively sabotaging that obviously for its own geopolitical purposes. So, point being that local capacity is the gold standard in terms of being able to defend yourself, both in a military sense and even in an intelligence sense. Because as they say, quantity itself is a form of quality. So if the world outside gets to realize that Nigeria has a certain size and competence of defense capacity, that in itself serves as a deterrent for people to even want to even interfere and meddle, even if it's not military interference, even if it's intelligence interference. For example, the fact that North Korea has these nukes, which is probably never going to use, but just the fact that it has them severely reduces the likelihood that external actors are going to intervene and interfere in North Korea just because it has that huge deterrent. That deterrent is what we don't have. So, I mean, I hope all of this isn't just English we're speaking on a podcast. I hope all of this becomes reality someday. Because I would really love to live on a continent someday where I feel like I am equal to everybody else on the planet, and I feel like I am protected, I am defended, like other people feel, because presently I don't feel that way at all, and presently none of us feels that way.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, thank you, David. That's it for. I will let you give us your final thoughts, and then we will call it a day. We appreciate your time today, and all the best. Well, go ahead.
I mean, there isn't really that much to say, but I mean, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. It was a fun conversation. I appreciate the fact that we're having sort of intellectually conversations that have some intellectual depth in the Nigerian media space, because normally when I get called for this sort of interview, it's usually some very surface level questions that I get asked. And it's usually it can be very frustrating actually, just constantly trying to explain why 2 + 2 is 4. But both you and your audience appear to have a much more evolved understanding of how the world works and appear to be actually up to date with global events, which is very encouraging to see that, it's not every Nigerian that is just sleepwalking. So, whatever it is you're doing, please keep doing it.
All right. Thank you so much. We are glad. That's what we do here. We try to give people like you who go to channels and arise, they give you 20 minutes or 30 minutes. We give you enough time to be able to explain things in details. We appreciate you. Thank you so much. And next time we call you, hopefully you will come back and join us again.
Thank you for having me.
So we take a break. When we come back, we are going to do our review. And thank you all for watching. I appreciate you.
Onye ọma zoro obi o, akwa nwa zoro obi o, Maxi ịbịa bunyegokwanụ m n'ofu ube n'azụ ụlaga n'ịbịazigo, mmanwụ ụlaga do n'ịbịazigo, akwa nwa ilochi o, biko rapụ zoro ka ọ nabazi ya. Onye ọma zoro biko, abụmma nwatara ndosari, ịbịa onye negwana m ụlagado n'ịbịazigo, mma ụlagado n'ịbịazigo, abụmma nwe ilochilo, biko rapụ zoro ọ na-abazi ya. Mazi wekowa odogu no kwere zunaka, onyo mani gadele mo, mazi ni bazi ibu go wuti baladi. Odogu na chala noka, ezi nwanne m legadele mo, olagado n'ibyazigo no, mma olagado n'ibyazigo, amama mwilo chilo, bikora muzoro, anabazi, te, onyama zoro no. Sorry, Ibya Muyana Guanamo, Fubenaro, Mulaga, Doni Biazugo, Nazaboy, Mulaga, Doni Biazugo, Amama Wilo Chilo, Biko Rapuzero, Anabazi, Ice. odogwu kenere m ikeji ogo amakwa m n'ike agwụghị gị wele igwe kwele nnukwu ikeji obodo elebe gị igwe
egwu ka mbụ na-ekene ọmọgọ ndị nsọ Chukwu Emeka Lumo Ikechukwu na-egazi ezi nwanne m ekene ịlapụlụ ife niile na-eme wee bịa ka gosili na anyị na gị bụ nwanne wisdom ga-adị ka nne gị maịkị ka ogobanya bụ egwu esili mmaksi ọ bụ na-etiri egwu a malụkwa malụ n'imego m ife ọjọọ wee sị gị nwanne m ife ọkụ na ịchọlụ na ngeme wisdom onume ekene gị gbamanwụ iyo iyo biko lapụ na-abasị ya
zoro 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 zoro